Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Izuku received the all for one instead of the one for all, before going to the UA Academy, and became a hero, part 1. So before we start, please go check out the author of this fanfic, link is in the description. Also subscribe to our channel, and like this video. So let's begin the video. All men were not created equal. That was the harsh truth he had learned early in life. He had cried, and little by little he had come to see the way things were. Mercy was something the strong gave to the weak. He had met the man who told him that when he was 7, and quirkless. It was raining again. The sky was black with thick clouds that swallowed up the light of what this morning had looked like a beautiful day. The gutters ran over with water that rushed along their lengths. Drains clogged with dead leaves carried along by the downpour until dirt and depth made the water black, and hid the last traces of autumn. The scent of wet earth and concrete lay heavy on the air. Midoriya Izuku was already soaked through. It looked like it was going to be a nice day that morning, and his mother hadn't packed a raincoat in his bag when he was sent off to school. The rain made his hair stick close to his head, as a trickle of cold water ran down the back of his neck to the joint where his t-shirt met his school bag. His mom would be here soon to pick him up for sure. She always came, and picked him up from the playground after work. Cold, and alone Izuku curled up inside the tunnel, and listened to the raindrops hammer the bright yellow plastic. All the other kids had gone home already. He was the only one that was still here when the rain had started to fall, but it wasn't all bad. Sitting away from the damp spot where water had gathered below the leak in the tunnel's joints, Izuku pulled his backpack in front of himself, and pulled out the notebook his mother had got him to practice his hero work. He didn't have anything to add to it, but he could run his fingers over the glossy color cover image of All Might. With a plop, a round drop of water falls from the leaking tunnel roof, and runs down the printed face of the hero. A warmer drop of water runs down Izuku's face, as he quietly cries. The playground after school was one of the few times he could cry without it being a burden. As long as the teachers could see him, they didn't worry. The waterlogged rubber matting of the playground floor squelched, as someone stood on it, and Izuku looked up, quickly wiping away his tears so his mother couldn't tell he'd been crying, and grabbing his bag. He hadn't heard her car pull up, but, as he looks up he realizes that it isn't his mother coming to take him home. A tall, suited stranger cuts a menacing silhouette against the pouring rain. Raindrops stop, and run off the air 5 inches away from his body, leaving him perfectly dry, as he looks towards the playground. Izuku shrinks back into the tunnel. He doesn't want the tall, unfamiliar man to notice him, but at the same time the way the water just stops, and slides away from him is fascinating. He wonders if it is a quirk that makes a force field or one that is controlling the rain not to fall on him. As he watches, the man turns away from the playground, and walks back towards the school. He knocks, and the door is opened. Izuku can't tell what they are saying, but he feels a bit more relaxed. That guy was probably just a parent looking for their child. If the teachers didn't mind, he can't be a bad guy. He still puts his book away when the playground matting squelches again. The plastic tunnel echoes with the sound of someone knocking on the outside of it. "Excuse me, young man, there is someone looking for you," an unfamiliar voice says, and Izuku clutches his bag close to his chest. The man in the suit is standing outside the tunnel. Now he is not looking through the rain which, with a hiss, starts to fall harder and faster. He can see his body seems to be made of a thick black fog that the rainfall is compressing inwards. 2 eyes gleam yellow in the darkest part of the mass. I'm Midoriya Izuku," he introduces himself. He remembered what his mother said about how even people that look scary would be nice. He bows politely to the adult, and extends a hand. It might be his imagination, but the bright yellow eyes seemed to curve up like a smile, as a foggy black hand was extended for him to shake. It felt kind of like shaking hands with water. "You may call me Kurojiri, Izuku." The black smoke man waits, half kneeling so he can look into the tunnel, while Izuku picks up his school bag. "Why are you waiting here in the rain?" Now that he looks carefully, Izuku can see where a small cloud of black mist is catching the droplets before they can fall on the man. The rain seems to be getting heavier. He can barely see the school building. "I'm waiting for my mom," he tells him. "Why not wait inside then?" Kurojiri asks him. "They'll just get in the way," he says in a small voice, and looks at his shoes. "Are you being bullied?" Kurojiri asks him. Izuku doesn't reply, but he draws up his arms defensively, and Kurojiri can see the bruises before he can cover them. Kurojiri doesn't press the point. "Your teacher tells me you don't have many friends, that you prefer to be alone." "Why is that?" Kurojiri asks. "I'm not strong, and can't do anything useful, so I'd just be a burden on everyone else," Izuku mumbles, trying not to meet the eyes suspended in the fog. The black fog seems to grow. "Do you often feel like a burden, Izuku?" Kurojiri asks him. Slowly, and hesitantly Izuku nods. "Because you don't have a quirk?" Kurojiri inquires further, and Izuku looks up in surprise. How did you dash? He starts to ask. I asked? Kurojairi says simply. Izuku, I represent a specialized group working on researching how and why quirks are expressed. The black fog billows, as a shiny white business card slides out of Kurojairi's palm. He carefully gives it to the child. It looks official enough, and Izuku has no reason to think he is lying. I was referred to your case by a friend of mine. It won't be easy or fast, but I think we can help you. Izuku starts crying again. He can't help it. The tears feel burning hot against his cold, wet skin. Really? Really? The black mist curls back in. With a rumble of thunder it starts to hail. Chunks of ice bounce across the rubbing matting, and rattle off the roof of the tunnel. Izuku yelps in surprise. Right, we should be getting you back. If you don't dry off you might catch a cold. Kurojairi examines his wristwatch. Your mother will be worrying. The black smoke billows outwards, and fills the tunnel until it is all Izuku could see or feel. When it draws back he is standing inside the school building. Do consider giving us a call if you have any questions. Kurojairi's voice echoes, as the last of the black mist fades away. Izuku slips the card inside his notebook where it won't be lost, and slings his bag over his shoulder. After 3 years it hurt to even hope. He didn't dare mention it to his mother over dinner, but as soon as the dishes were done he went to the computer, and slipped the card from the pages of his book. Had done research on heroes, and their quirks for a long time, and he knew of quirk therapists, those who dealt with unusual manifestations of quirks related to childhood trauma. Sometimes when a quirk first manifested it could be traumatic for a child, and they would end up suppressing part of their power subconsciously. It was probably too much to hope for. It would be an expensive waste of time for no result, but the tiny spark of hope glowing in his chest hurt. He wasn't going to be a burden on his mother by telling her about this, because if there was even a tiny sliver of hope he knew that she would do anything to help him. She had done so much already. He waited until she was busy before he snuck downstairs to call the number on the card, and waited with bated breath, as it rang. The person who picked it up was not Kurojairi. What do you want? They snap. I was given this number by Kurojairi-san. Izuku stammers, checking to see if he had entered the number correctly. A kid? The adult on the other side sounds bored. I don't know what Kurojairi's playing at, but I'll tell you what I told all the others. It's going to be 100,000 for an assessment, got that? Call again when you've got the cash. The phone goes dead, and Izuku numbly stares at the receiver in shock. He slams a hand over his mouth to stifle the sudden sob that threatened to break through. He can't stop the tears from starting to form in his eyes. 100,000 yen was more money than he had seen in his life. Maybe if they worked hard to save up for months they might be able to afford the assessment. But what if they just said the same thing as the doctor? What if there was something they could do, but it would be even more expensive? He couldn't put the burden of paying that much money on his mother who already worked so hard. Taking care not to make much sound he put the phone back in its cradle, and returned to his room, where he buried his face in the pillow, and let himself start to cry. The small flame of hope is snuffed out. 100,000 yen was too much to throw away on such a small chance. He shouldn't tell his mother at all. It was probably just a scam or something. In his head he makes up 1,000 reasons why it doesn't matter, and he should just give up. But he puts the business card back between the pages of his notebook before drifting into sleep. In the morning he couldn't remember his dreams, only that they had been filled with darkness and sorrow. His mother notices his sad look, as she makes him breakfast, and gives him a few soft words of encouragement before sending him off to school. He doesn't tell her the real reason he looked down. Today is another gray day. It isn't raining, but the clouds from yesterday still swallow the sunlight, and cluster blackly on the horizon with the threat of rain. A cold wind blows across the playground, plucking the browning leaves from the trees, and hurling them into the gutter. It's turning into the kind of cold autumn week that shows winter is coming soon. Izuku is glad he has his scarf when he steps outside for lunch. The wind is freezing, and even through his coat he feels like shivering whenever the wind blows. Izuku sits on the benches outside the playground, and unwraps his bento. His mother had written "You can do it" on his rice with ketchup. Oh, there are little octopus sausages too. Deku. Katsuki leans over the back of the bench, and Izuku jumps. Had been too focused on his lunch to realize that Katsuki and his friends were walking towards him. Now it's too late to run. Izuku shrinks back against the seat. Hey Kaken, he replies. A small explosion detonates in Katsuki's palm, as he leans in with a smile. It is not a friendly smile. It's a cold day, isn't it? Katsuki says. One of his friends chuckles. Yeah. Izuku doesn't like where this is going. So why don't you give me that scarf of yours? Katsuki grins. Izuku raises his hand to the scarf. But it's mine. He starts to protest on instinct. Katsuki's smile gets even less friendly. Are you saying you won't give it to me? A larger explosion bursts from his palm, and Izuku jumps. Oh no, now he's upset. I didn't say that dash! Izuku yelps, as his scarf is forcibly tugged from the other side, constricting his throat before pulling free. He is pulled forwards by it, and that knocks his bento on the ground. Rice spills over the concrete, and he nearly falls off the bench. Katsuki's friend drops the scarf into Katsuki's hand. Now that I look at it, this is a pretty crappy scarf. I'm not sure I want it. Katsuki laughs, weighing Izuku's scarf in his hands. My mom made that kaken. Izuku whimpers, trying to hold himself back from crying. A larger blast explodes from Katsuki's palm, and the sheared edges of the scarf flutter to the ground. Whoops, he says insincerely. Guess I saved you the trouble of throwing out the trash. That means kaken. Izuku sniffles, and wipes his eyes with the back of his hand. Katsuki just laughs, and walks off, already talking about how he was going to climb to the top of the playground. Izuku stomps out the flames before anything bad can happen. The only part of his scarf that is left is the fringe of tassels at the ends. He sobs, as he picks up the burnt ends, and the remains of his lunch. He would get in trouble with the teacher if he left a mess. He tries not to cry, as he puts the whole mess into one of the bins. Now he's hungry, and cold, but if Kaken sees him crying he might come, and tease him more for being a crybaby. It's safer to just keep out of his way. Katsuki didn't used to be mean to him, but someone without a quirk couldn't complain about how they were treated. Kaken was strong, and was going to be a great hero someday, Izuku thought. The most he could do is support him from the sidelines. Izuku found a little corner where he could sit, and draw in his notebook. The wind was cold, and his stomach kept on rumbling, but no one bothered him until lunch hour was over, and he was back in his class. His stomach kept growling during lessons. He could tell Kaken was looking at him, and laughing every time it made a noise. His face went red with embarrassment, and he tried to hide behind his books. By the time class was over, and Katsuki's mother came to pick him up, Izuku's stomach was seriously growling from not eating. He sat on the swings, rocking back and forth slightly to distract himself from the hunger pangs. He is staring vacantly across the empty playground. This was the only time he could really play on it without being worried about disturbing the other kids, but today he just felt sad. A flutter of movement catches his eye. A scrap of paper. No, that's money. Izuku leaps off the swings and runs after it. If it is money, then maybe he can get some food from the convenience store before his mom comes to pick him up. Maybe the luck gods are making up for this morning. The wind picks up, and he has to chase after the floating scrap, and jump to catch it. With care not to let it escape, he looks at it. It's a 5,000 yen bill. Wow, he can't believe someone just dropped something like this. That was a lot of money. Actually, there was another bill lying on the pavement, and another. Izuku looks up from the purple paper bill, and his blood freezes in his veins. The loose bills have spilled from the top of a bag being held by an unconscious man with a skull-shaped mask in a black outfit. Blood is caked on the side of their head, and one arm dangles in a way no arm with intact bones could. He has fallen over on the sidewalk, and Izuku can see where a powerful punch has torn through the shirt, and taken skin off his back. Izuku nearly stepped on him. A villain. Quickly he looks around. There are no heroes near here, and no sounds of pursuit. Eventually someone would report this, but for now they were completely unobserved. Did he escape only to collapse? What should he do? The wind tugs at the note in his hand, and he finds his gaze being drawn like a magnet towards the bag. There was a lot of money in there. With that much money he could pay for the therapist no problem without putting a burden on his mother. If he used it to become a hero, then he could pay it back later, right? Those were the thoughts that passed through the 7-year-old's head, and despite the tight feeling of guilt at the back of his throat, he grabs at the bag, and shoves it deep into his own backpack. Once he does, he realizes the villain has dropped a small metal case, as well, and, aware of the choice he's already made, he grabs that too, and runs back to the playground, as fast as his legs can carry him. Any second now he's expecting to hear sirens or someone call out to him, but there is nothing but the howling of the wind around him. Every minute seems to become an hour with the bag of stolen cash resting heavily on his back, as he crawls inside the tunnel once more, and waits to be caught. When his mother does arrive, he is feeling too sick in the stomach to want to eat dinner, and sent to bed early. He waits with bated breath on the other side of the bedroom door until he hears the shower running, and knows it is safe to go downstairs. He pulls out the business card. If it's for the right reasons, surely this is alright? The phone is answered on the third ring. Who are you? What do you want? The same grumpy adult answers the phone. I have the money, Izuku says quietly. His mouth feels like it has been filled with ashes. Ah, it's the kid again. The voice sighs over the phone. Guess I can book you a meeting with Kurojiri. Come to the following address, tell no one, and bring the cash with you. Izuku memorized the time and address, and with a click he was left with a dead receiver, a school bag full of stolen money, and a faint wavering hope. Izuku often thought about what could have happened. What if he hadn't seen the money? What if he hadn't made the phone call? What if Kaken hadn't tipped over his lunch? Where would he be? Who would he be if he had never met his teacher? It had come as a surprise to him to find out that power could come from many places. The sick feeling in Izuku's stomach hadn't gone away by morning. He had barely slept too. Every car that passed the apartment, every wail of a cat in the night, every tree branch tapping against the window had jolted him awake. He lay in bed with his blankets pulled up, as high as they could, and tried his hardest to go back to sleep. By the time the sun had risen enough he could no longer deny it was morning. He was still exhausted. His mother noticed he wasn't eating much breakfast either, and he flinched when she felt his forehead. "Izuku, you should stay home from school today," she told him. "I will ring the school, and tell them you're sick. Will you be alright on your own?" Not trusting himself to speak, Izuku nods. "Get to bed, and rest until you feel better. I can take care of the dishes by myself," she tells him, and again Izuku nods. He goes back up the stairs, his school bag seeming too suspicious tucked under his bed, as his mother tucks him into bed. She strokes his hair, and tells him it's going to be alright while the guilt eats at him from inside. He almost breaks down in tears, then tells her everything that's happened, but his voice sticks in his throat, and she leaves before he can speak a word. Once the door closes he reaches under his bed for his school bag. He undoes the zip, and peeks inside. The bundles of bills look back at him. For a moment he had almost hoped it was a dream. Izuku guiltily waits in his room with the bag on his lap until he hears her car drive off. He holds the bag tight against his chest, and breathes deeply to try and calm himself. Once his heart is no longer hammering in his chest he slides off the bed, puts on his shoes, and sneaks out. With his bag on his back he tries to look like any other child walking to school, trying to force himself to be calm. To take his mind off the weight of the stolen cash on his back he tries to think about other things. What was quirk therapy going to be like? Was there just questions or was there physical training? Would there be hypnosis? A quirk with the ability to draw out others' powers? Would it work? Now he is just feeling sad. What if it didn't? What if all they could tell him was that he was going to be a quirkless nobody forever? What if nothing worked? He is so caught up in his thoughts he doesn't notice where he is walking until he bumps into someone. Sorry. He quickly apologizes, and bows before realizing who he has bumped into. A hero. His memory fills in the blanks. The D-ranked newcomer hero, Green Flash, recently graduated from the position of sidekick who was looking to make a name for themselves, and establish their own hero agency. Their super speed quirk meant they could get to the site of disasters easily to help others, though they were looking for a big break to prove their worth, something like recovering stolen goods. His blood feels like it has turned to ice, the sweat running down his face is even colder. He isn't sure he can open his mouth without vomiting. Take care to watch where you're going, kid. The black and white costumed hero with the green lightning bolt emblem across his chest tells him. Izuku is sure that somehow he can see inside his bag. Any second now he is going to ask about it. There's been a robbery nearby. The hero reaches out a black gloved hand, and Izuku's heart skips a beat. Maybe it's not too late to say something, but the back of his throat is desert dry. Izuku's tongue feels like lead, and he can't seem to get his mouth to open. Try not to get in the way of the hero's work. Green Flash ruffles his hair, and in a trademark bolt of green energy he zooms away. Izuku waits frozen in place, trying to get his breathing back to normal. He had run into a hero, a real hero, and he hadn't been caught. He had thought for sure he was going to die from the guilt. It's kind of funny in a sick, twisted way. If he had been told a day ago he was going to meet a hero, he would have been excited. Now all he can feel is sick to the pit of his stomach. The sickness lingers, paralyzing his tongue, and increasing the weight on his back until he gets to where the man on the phone told him to go. He was expecting a school or a doctor's office, perhaps one fancier than his regular school, but this place looked more like a warehouse. Still, he double-checks against what he was told, and this is the address. With his heart in his throat Izuku pushes open the door. It creaks. "Hello?" he asks, but the dusty corridor is silent. He takes a step forward, and the darkness rises to meet him. Slowly the doors creak closed on the empty warehouse. Izuku steps forwards into light. The darkness dies down around him, and when he turns and looks back there is nothing but a wall behind him. When he looks in front of him this place doesn't look like a school either. Never having seen a bar, Izuku isn't sure how to describe it. "Please take a seat in Izuku," Kurojairi tells him, and he sits at one of the tables. There are 3 people here. One of them is Kurojairi who is cleaning a glass. "You got the cash?" the second asks, and Izuku recognizes the voice as the person he had talked to over the phone. "Yes." he stutters, and pulls out a bundle of notes from his bag. Please say it's enough. I need this. His voice trails off into a sob. Please. The man holds out his hand for the entire thing. Izuku hands over the bag to him, and wonders what exactly he has gotten himself into. The third figure, a gaunt teenager covered in hands, starts to scratch at his neck. He waits with his hands in his lap, slowly balling up into fists, as the school bag is opened. A tear he can't hold back starts to run down his cheek. Hey, I didn't think you could do it, kid. The adult lifts out the bag of money. Yeah, that's more than enough. He weighs it in his palm, and writes down a figure on a napkin, then opens the briefcase Izuku forgot he put in there. Talk about going above and beyond. Looks like you're my new favorite kid. He takes out what looks like a small cylinder of metal. Do you know what this kid is? Izuku shakes his head. This here is immutabilium, a quirk-made metal that can't be affected by any quirk after it's created. That seems a strange thing for you to know, broker, Kurojairi says, as he puts down the glass. Well, these little babies here sell for 3.8 billion each. And it looks like we've got 50 right here. Plus, another billion in cash. 191 billion? Izuku yelps. Yeah. The broker holds up the metal cylinder to the light. Seeing as how they're restricted material that can only be purchased by the Department of Defense. Do we kill him now? The teenager covered in hands says all of a sudden, and lurches forwards in his chair. Izuku freezes in his chair, the tears streaming down his face now flowing freely, as fear grips his heart. The hand reaching out towards him seems to be moving in slow motion so he can take in every detail. The hand has grimy, uneven nails, and unhealthily pale skin. His gaze moves up to the fresh, raw scratches nearly on the point of bleeding gouged into the man's neck. The face wreathed in stringy gray hair between that dead clutching hand is gray with cracked peeling lips, chewed raw with peeling flakes of skin dried around the unhealed wound. The eyes set in dull sockets gleam with a rabid animal's killing intent. A smile unnaturally stretches out those wounded dry lips in a horrifying mixture between a beast's snarl and some unearthly creature, lacking humanity of its own, trying out human facial muscles. It is through luck rather than composure that Izuku manages not to wet himself before a billow of black smoke opens up in front of the hand. The figure on the TV lowers his hand, and Izuku realizes what he had dismissed, as a T.V show was in fact a fourth person he hadn't noticed, watching them through the screen. Izuku, the figure on the screen, asks, as the man covered with hands throws himself back down on his chair in a sulk. Did you steal this? Wordlessly Izuku nods. The figure on screen folds his arms, pressing his palms together. Why? It is a simple question, and one that until now he thought he knew the answer to. To be a hero? He answers, his voice trembling and weak. He hadn't meant for it to sound like a question either. The teenager with the hand stirs again, and the figure on the screen notices. Kurojairi looks towards him, ready to hold him back if need be. A hero isn't a person who would steal this much. I am going to ask you again, and this time I want you to answer honestly. This time the question is louder, and seems to penetrate into his soul. Why? Why did he want to be a hero? He thought he had known, but now he wasn't sure. He started to ask himself why. Why did he want to help people? Why did he care so much about being a hero when there were other ways to help people? What did he really want? He wanted to be someone people would look up to. He wanted to be someone who was acknowledged by everyone, and everyone acknowledged heroes. He thinks of the moment the other day, sitting on the bench with the burnt ends of the scarf in front of him. He had told his mother it had gotten lost, and seen she didn't quite believe him. What he wanted was to stop that from ever happening again. What he wanted was to turn this unfair world into one where he was no longer on the bottom. I want power! He screams without meaning to, tears rolling down his cheeks at the deep frustration of the unfairness of it all, and he knows, as he screams, that it is the truth. The figure on the screen waits so motionless Izuku can't tell if it has frozen or not, as he sets his face stubbornly with determination, and wipes his tears away with the back of his hand. There is silence in the bar. Kurojairi, open a warp gate. I wish to visit, the figure on the screen says, and Kurojairi obligingly lets the dark fog billow outwards. The figure that steps through it is tall and intimidating. His suit is at least as nice as Kurojairi, if not nicer, but his face is hidden behind a black skull-like mask with a thick collar of overlapping metal plates. You think you are weak, he says in a voice that chills Izuku's bones. You are quirkless, and this society tells you that means you are without value, but they are wrong. I was what I too used to think, but there are two different kinds of strength in this world, those who were given great power, and those that have the ruthlessness and cunning to achieve their goals without it. You have the second kind of strength. As scared, as seeing this intimidating figure up close makes Izuku feel a little bit happy that someone thinks he is strong. The figure rests a gloved hand on his forehead. Boy, what are your parents' quirks? He asks, My mother can psychically manipulate small objects, and my father breathes fire. Izuku manages to say without stammering, though his voice is faint with all. Power is something that can be given, but that desire to achieve your goals no matter what is much harder to teach, so I will give something to you, as a welcoming gift. Mercy is something the strong give to the weak, so accept this, as a gift from one who is truly strong. There is a sensation like a ball of something hot being pressed into his forehead, and he yelps briefly at the unexpected pain before there is a feeling like something being switched on inside of him. As surely as he heard sounds or smelled something, he had the sense that nearby there was a fire. It seemed to glow in his vision like a highlighted object in a video game, and he reached towards it without moving. The broker's cigarette flares up with a sudden violence, and he swears, and drops it. The flame doesn't drop. It hovers in the air, as a perfect sphere of flame. Psychic control of flames. The quirk I have given to you, the tall suited figure tells him. You will return here after your studies, and I will teach you to control it. Kurojairi, broker, makes the necessary arrangements. He turns to leave. See Tamura, the motivations of humanity are not always what they say they believe in. When you look deeper you see their true nature. Welcome to the organization, Izuku. The figure steps back through the warp gate, and leaves Izuku sitting at the table with a strange lightness in his limbs. He had a quirk? Just like that? This was beyond what he had imagined, but he gestured like he was beckoning a kitten, and the ball of flame slowly hovered over to him. He could feel a connection to it, this small fire his quirk had created. Get some control of that, kid! The broker snarls, and lights another cigarette. He takes the bag of banknotes, and the metal briefcase, and tosses the now empty school bag onto the table before leaving. Sorry. Izuku apologizes with a bow, but there is no sign the broker notices or cares. He is left alone with Kurojairi, and the teenager with the hands, Tamura, he recalls, and a deep uncomfortable silence. If Sensei didn't step in you really would have killed me, wouldn't you? He says in a small voice, knowing it is the truth. Yes, Kurojairi says without hesitation or pity. If you were from a wealthy family we would have held you to ransom first, but seeing as you came by the money through theft we would have killed you first. Does that happen a lot? Izuku asks with his throat dry. The crumpled cover of his notebook looks at him accusingly from the depths of his bag. It is a scam the League often uses, Kurojairi tells him. The League? Izuku can't help but ask, as if somehow this was going to make sense, but dreading the answer. The League of Villains. Us. Kurojairi replies in the same calm, measured tone. So you are villains, Izuku says under his breath to himself. With everything that had just happened there could be no doubt this group were villains, and serious ones too. He really could have died. He could still die. These were people who had no compunctions about killing a child, but they had accepted him. He had been given a quirk, and a teacher, and really, had already committed a crime too. Didn't that mean he was already a villain too? I think I need a moment. Izuku feels the fear rise inside him. Do you need anything? We have soft drinks for mixers, and juice. I can make you something to eat, as well, Kurojairi asks, and Izuku can't help but notice his genteel tone doesn't change between talking about food or murder. For some reason that is comforting rather than terrifying to him right now. Can I have an orange juice please? He asks, and as he feels his body calm, his hunger returns. And if it's not too much trouble I would like something to eat too please. Does carriage sound appealing to you? Kurojairi asks. Yes please. Izuku nods. I want that too, Tamura says at the same time, and Izuku feels a brief stab of fear before he realizes that the teenager covered in hands is ignoring him. He eats quietly until his stomach is no longer twisting in pain, keeping an eye on Tamura in case he decides he wants to kill him after all. He has a feeling that Kurojairi isn't going to kill him unless there was a reason for it, but he can't help but feel Tamura would try and kill him at any time, and he wouldn't know why. For now Tamura seems to be ignoring him, but Izuku doubts he would ever not be scared of him. After he finished eating, Kurojairi explained the system he was going to put in place. Kurojairi was going to contact his mother and say he had been recommended for a special teaching course. The cost would be nominal, enough not to draw suspicion without putting financial pressure on Izuku's family. He would call that evening and tell his mother. Tomorrow he would have his first lesson, and after that he could tell his classmates he had a quirk. After that Kurojairi opened a portal back, and he walked the rest of the way back home with a strangely light heart. He had hated being weak. When he looked back at his past self he found he hated them for their weakness. He hated the way they were afraid to speak what they thought. He hated the way they lived their lives in expectation of a blow or a harsh word. He hated the way they hated themselves in a world that tried to deny them even the right to exist. There was a big difference between acquiring power and owning it, as he had found out. Merely possessing it didn't mean he could use it more competently than a child. He had known this, but more often than he should he let his heart rule over his head. He remembered well the day he decided he would stop being weak. Izuku slept well that night, and in the morning his mother declared him cured, and sent him back to school. This time, despite the still gloomy skies, he felt lighthearted. It would take time to learn his powers and, despite what Sensei said, as soon as he got them Izuku had a deep desire to experiment. He didn't want to try anything too obvious, it would be hard to explain, and it would be dangerous trying to manipulate fire without having control of it. So he worked on figuring out the limits of his new senses on the walk to school. Even through walls he could detect where there were flames. It was a sixth sense of sorts, one linked entirely to fire, and something he really couldn't relate to his other senses. It was like being blind, and suddenly being able to see. There was no experience Head had previously that it lined up with. Still, for the sake of ease he decided to call it his fire sight. Yeah, that was a cool name for a power. His fire sight only picked up flames. Things like electrical sparks or flammable materials were still hidden to the fire sight until something ignited them. Each flame had a different look that told him about its origin and strength. Around here the only lights were from cigarettes, gas stoves, and the occasional candle. Like a spider in a web there were connections threads that linked him to each source of fire. The closer the flame was to him the stronger the connection, the larger the thread. The furthest away fires had only a stretched thin thread before it faded out of the fire sight entirely. Izuku does a few quick calculations. His range is approximately 20 meters centered on himself. The closer he was to the fire, the stronger the connection, the quicker it would react to him, and the easier he could manipulate it. He'll have to test that hypothesis. Tearing a corner off one of his notebook pages he holds it in his palm, and focuses. The triangle of paper remains dead to his fire sight, and even though he can exert his quirk powerfully enough to bend the fire sight threads it doesn't catch a light. Unknown to Izuku for a brief moment every open flame bends towards him, so he doesn't have the power to actually generate a flame. Izuku sighs. If he can't use his quirk to make a fire, and his heart feels light, as he thinks his quirk, then he'll have to get a cigarette lighter or something so he can make a flame for him to manipulate. Otherwise he'll be defenseless. Lost in his own thoughts he starts to mutter under his breath, generating exercises he is going to try out after his first lesson with Sensei, and making plans for testing his powers without hurting himself. Despite knowing he needed to wait for proper instruction he couldn't help trying a little experimentation of his own and, from the pulsing pain on the heel of his palm he had learned his most important weakness. He wasn't immune to the fire he controlled. He could still be burnt. He still felt the heat from the flames, and they burned oxygen around him. Having flames too close to him meant he could barely breathe, meaning any plan to cover himself with fire like the flame hero endeavor was doomed to failure. He had to focus on the flames to control them, and flames he wasn't focusing on would go out unless they had something else to burn when he lost focus. He had learned a lot from just the few minutes he had with the League of Villains, but there was a lot more he wanted to learn about using this power. Maybe next he could try shaping the fire into something other than a ball? His fire sight picked up something unusual, different to the usual flares of light, and approaching from the path behind him rather than in one of the houses. This one is bigger, more intense in heat, and appears without warning, and disappears just as fast. He can only think of one thing that made a fire like that, mostly because he was always wary of it. Kaken was coming! He knew that Katsuki walked to school the same way as him, but he hoped he wouldn't run into him. Quickly he looks around, and hides behind a pair of rusty dustbins until he hears the footsteps approach. Kaken walks right past him, complaining about some part in a video game that annoyed him. An explosion bursts from his palm to illustrate his point, and the flame flares brightly in Izuku's fire sight. He could see it. He could control it. Izuku tucks that little thought away for later, and watches until he's sure Kaken is far ahead of him before coming out from behind the dustbins. Now all he had to do was look for the explosions, and he had a way of avoiding Kaken when he was grumpy. He smiled to himself, as he walked the rest of the way to school. He arrived just before the bell rang, slipping into his seat, and getting out his school books. He also gets out his new notebook, one with a black cover. Technically it was an old notebook he found in one of his drawers, but he hadn't written much in it. He tore out those pages, scribbled out what he had written on the cover, and wrote in careful hand on the cover Hero Training No. 1. He had to write down everything until he fully understood his new quirk. He started by scrawling the morning's observations on one page. On the other page he started to doodle costume ideas. After that he turns over another page, and starts to write down the exercises he wants to do when he has the time to experiment. After that he gets told off by the teacher for muttering, and actually starts trying to focus on the lesson. At lunch he trains his fire sight by avoiding running into Kaken on the playground, and writes more notes. Even though he's pretty sure at this point it's too late to become a hero, it has become a habit of his. The crumpled face of All Might stares accusingly at him from the bottom of his school bag. The briefcase had folded the cover of his other notebook in, and he hadn't straightened it out. The cover was a cheap print, and, as the paper folded, it left a line of white cutting through the picture of the symbol of peace. The mark seems accusing to him, and his forgotten guilt boils up inside him. What was he doing? He had betrayed his childhood hero. He had stolen billions of yen from a villain, and sold it to a group of villains in exchange for a quirk. He had nearly died. He still might. Why was he pretending any of this was okay? He can feel the familiar welling up in his eyes. That means he is about to start crying, and tries to hold himself steady. The events of the past few days wash all over him at once, and leave him trembling. This wasn't something a child like him should get into, but he had. He couldn't change the past, and if he tried to back out now, the League of Villains would kill him. Not just him, they would kill his family, as well. They knew where he lived. That thought paralyzes him, and he feels cold, as if the last of the sunlight had been snuffed out. A hand rests heavily on his shoulder, and shocks him from his despair. He looks up, the tears frozen in his eyes. Hey Deku, I didn't see you yesterday. Izuku doesn't know why. The thing that runs through his mind is that he should make a note that the fire sight doesn't work when he is depressed. Compared to the look in Tamura's eyes, when his hand was about to touch him, Katsuki was kind of pathetic. He was nothing compared to a real villain. I was sick yesterday, he says without looking away or stuttering. I miss you. Katsuki's voice is transparently insincere. Kaken used to be his friend before he got his quirk. It was after that Katsuki started pushing him away. Now he only noticed him when he wanted to tease him, and look down on him. With his amazing quirk, Kaken didn't have time for someone like him. That was in the past. Compared to Tamura, he wasn't that scary. I'm not in the mood for Kaken, he says, and turns back to the notebook. Katsuki's hand tightens on his shoulder. Are you looking down on me? Katsuki snarls. I am looking at you, Kaken, Izuku says, trying to keep his voice as calm and level as Kurogyri, and pulls Katsuki's hand off his shoulder before he can detonate an explosion. The lunch bell rings. This isn't over, Katsuki snarls, as he roughly shoves past him. Izuku knows it's not. Kaken is going to be really angry, and fight him later on, but Izuku doesn't feel as afraid as he used to. He wasn't the same weak Deku as before. He had been acknowledged as strong by someone far beyond Kaken's current level. He was a member of the League of Villains now. He couldn't change the past, but his future was going to be under his control, and he isn't going to let anyone take that from him, especially not Kaken. That was his new goal in life. He couldn't turn back, so he was going to run forwards with all his heart. Throughout the day he could feel Kaken glaring at the back of his head while he took his notes. His fire sight showed the faint firework crackle of small explosions dancing on Katsuki's palm, and he steeled himself for the end of class bell. He had already taken the first steps on this path, and he wasn't going to turn back now. He hadn't stopped when he had taken the money, but it is this moment here that feels like he is making the decision that will change his life. No matter how badly he got beaten, he wasn't going to be scared of Kaken anymore. He took care to have his work put away before Kaken came up to him, so he couldn't incinerate it. Katsuki still crushed one of his pencils before he could put it away out of a desire to break something. Izuku looks over the splintered mess dispassionately. He was so tired of this. He was tired of being the weak one. He was tired of having to placate Kaken because he had a quirk. The words he had said yesterday resound in him. He wants to be strong. He won't cower anymore. He's sure that Kaken intended to corner him here, so he slung his bag over his shoulder and started to walk towards the door. Hey, Deku! Katsuki yells after him, and he is already down the stairs and walking outside before they manage to catch up to him. But Izuku isn't trying to escape. He walks around the back of the school, by the now abandoned playground, and stops with his back to the wall. He drops his backpack so his back is pressed against the rough stone. Katsuki catches up with him in no time, his two friends waiting beside him. Izuku is surprised to find how much he hates them. They had strong quirks of their own. This world had favored them enough for them to be able to make an impression on their own. But they followed obediently after Kaken, desperate for the meager scraps of attention he gave them. Pathetic. They were what Sensei meant when he talked about two kinds of strength. Even with quirks they were weak. They lacked ambition, the ability to make goals, and the hunger to achieve them. They were no threat to him. 3-on-1? He said calmly. That seems excessive. He looked Katsuki directly in the eyes with no hesitation. I'm not scared of you, Kaken. Are you scared of me? The explosion flares in his fire sight. Like hell I am. Katsuki growls, and gestures for his lackeys to leave them. I'm going to beat that smirk right off your face. I am not smiling, Kaken, Izuku says calmly, and he's really not. He is ready, and waiting. Katsuki leads with a right swing. Izuku dodges, and his fist hits the wall with a crunch, and Katsuki screams in pain. Izuku drives his fist, as hard as he can, into Katsuki's stomach. He can tell it isn't a strong blow. He had trained himself at running and hiding, not fighting like Katsuki had, but he put all the force he could into it, and it was a soft target. Katsuki's other hand swung around and connected, hard, with the force of the first explosion, and he felt the flare in his fire sight. Izuku pushes the flames away from him, but the impact still strikes hard. A dribble of blood runs from his ringing ears, as the force of the explosion deafens him. Dimly Izuku realizes he is screaming, and tears of rage are streaming down his cheeks. With a scream he grabs Katsuki around the waist, and throws him onto the ground, leaping on top of him to try and keep him pinned, as he tries to force Katsuki's arms down. Katsuki headbutts him. Izuku bites him, as they both abandon all strategy whatsoever for trying to get in as many blows as they can. The next explosion hits the tarmac, and this time he grabs the fire in time and builds it up as hard as he can. The blaze doesn't damage Kachin's resilient palms, but Izuku draws it around himself like a scarf. It flares with a bright burning light, as he pours energy into it to blind his opponent. Like a whip he directs it at Katsuki's face, and Katsuki covers it with his hands. The flame licks around Katsuki's arms, leaving the skin pink with burns, and extinguishes, as Izuku forgets to focus on it in his rage. Izuku lashes out with his bare hands, and grabs Katsuki's face, intending to scratch at with his nails. In the center of his palm he feels something hot, something that feels different to the flames. It felt like the heat that Sensei had passed into his skull. He wants it, and so without thinking he drags it forcibly out of Katsuki, and takes it for himself. The heat travels up his arms, and instantly he feels a shift, this time through the skin of his body rather than his head. Katsuki slaps him open-palmed. It's still a decent hit, but there is no explosion behind it, and Katsuki's eyes widen in shock. Izuku punches him in the face, and detonates an explosion at the site of impact. The force rocks Katsuki's head backwards, and blood gushes from his nose. Izuku grabs the flames with his quirk, and wreathes his fists in them. He just doesn't want to fight, he wants to win. He was going to pay Kaken back for everything he had ever suffered. He was going to hurt him until Katsuki acknowledged him. "I'm the strong one now, Kaken!" He screams, and hits him, as hard as he can despite the stinging pain of the burns now running up his arms, and the torn, scorched skin of his fists. "Do you hear me? I'm the strong one now." The flames billowing up creates more sweat, which creates more explosions, which creates more flames for him to control. Even with his weak punches, if he detonates an explosion, as he hits he does a lot more damage. "It's your turn to be weak and helpless. Yours." He punctuates his yelling with punches. The blaze is growing stronger and stronger, as he gathers the flames as close to him as he can without burning himself in an intimidating cloak of flames. Each punch he drives into Katsuki is accompanied by a sharp crack and an explosion, as Izuku screams out his rage, and hits him over and over until Katsuki stops fighting back, and waits for it to be over. Izuku throws his head back, and screams at the sky in one terrible long cry of victory, and pain, and anger, and long-held grudges now settled. He pants for breath, his tears long since dried by the heat. His arms dangle loose at his sides, and pulse with the deep pain of the burns that have consumed his hands, and run up his arms. Aside from the burns he has a bruise on his jaw, and his hearing is faint in one ear, whereas Katsuki's face and arms were covered in blood and burns. His chest rises and falls slowly, and from what Izuku can see of his eyes behind the bruising that was starting to swell, he was still conscious, just wisely deciding not to move. His anger drains out of him as he works on steadying his breathing, and his awareness of his surroundings floods back in. His fire sight tells him that a few patches of weeds that had broken through the concrete are burning around him. There is blood gleaming on the tarmac, and nearby there are footsteps coming towards them. He breathes in and out slowly and calmly to steady himself, and his face twists into a smile. That was his first fight, and his first taste of victory. He remembered well the sweet sensation of beating someone, not to death. No, Kaken was, and still Ishii's friend, but to submission. Kaken had needed a good beating to help sort him out, to stop him from going down a dark path. After he learned that hard lesson they would be friends again, he was sure, and they'd both be better off in the end. It was the right thing to do, he was justified. Your mother told Kurojiru you got into a fight with a classmate, and expressed your quirk at school. His new teacher pressed the tips of his fingers together, and waited patiently. Izuku expected to be scolded at best. At worst he expected the League to kill him for ruining the plan. The hairs at the back of his neck prickle with the imagined sensation of Kurojiru creeping up on him from a warp gate. His mother had pulled him off Kaken, and he hadn't resisted in the slightest, just curled up against her chest, and cried, and a stabbing pain ran up his burned arms. They were wrapped in bandages to the elbow now, the white cloth soaked in a soothing solution that numbed the pain until he tried to touch something with the scorched skin. It was almost funny how the flames hadn't hurt at all until after the fight was done. They'd both been rushed to the nurse's office for emergency treatment by the teachers. Considering the damage to his arms, he had been about as injured as Katsuki was, but that wasn't the important thing. He had won the fight. In any other circumstances he would have been suspended, but when a quirk broke through it was hard to control, and dangerous for both the quirk user and anyone near them, so the teachers decided to let the burn stand, as their own punishment. After all, they said, it was just bad luck that his quirk had broken through during a fight. Izuku wasn't the kind of boy who would hurt someone like that on purpose, right? He had meant every part of it. Still, to the teachers he was a shy, helpless little decker that couldn't do anything. They saw Katsuki tease him every day, and they did nothing because Kaken had a strong quirk, and a bright future, as a hero ahead of him, and he didn't. None of them would believe the pathetic little Izuku started the fight. Well, he had a different way to prove his strength to them. He was still crying. He didn't want to be the kind of person who cried over everything anymore, but the tears flowed too easily. That was the first time he fought back. That was how he decided he was going to remember it. He had fought, and won because he wasn't weak, and, in that moment before the pain set in, he had felt like he was flying. It wasn't that he had no regrets, he had plenty, but they paled compared to the sweet sensation of his first meeting Kachen's face. Now it was time to face the music, or rather, face his teacher. He didn't regret the fight, but he did regret disappointing the one who had given him this strength. Yes, sensei. Any second now he expects to feel Kurogyri open a warp gate so his quirk can be taken back, or worse. Did you win decisively? The figure on screen asks. It is not the question Izuku was expecting, but he supposed he would have to get used to that. I don't know what that word means, he admits, his voice stammering with embarrassment. Would anyone doubt you'd win? Sensei asks more simply. No, Izuku says without stuttering, and means it completely. The teachers might not have understood, but every kid in the school would understand that he wasn't going to be pushed around anymore. Well done, Sensei says, and Izuku's trepidation becomes a spike of happiness. You're not mad at me? He asks out loud. The suited figure on screen laughs. I would have been mad if you lost. From what Kurogyri told me, you were settling a grudge, were you not? Izuku nods. And you were victorious, the masked figure says. Do you feel satisfied? Yes. Izuku smiles, and he's being honest. Even with the pain in his arms, he feels like it was something he had to do. And did you learn from it? His teacher prompts. Yes. Izuku replies openly. Then let us begin our lesson. You will not need your hands, so your injuries won't matter, Sensei says, and the sense of apprehension and fear he had felt after he stepped into Kurogyri's warp gate, and ended up here, in a basement, rather than where they had first met. Scenes from vaguely remembered mob movies had flashed through his head at that time. Tell me what you have learned, his teacher tells him. Somewhere between Izuku explaining that simple flame constructs were easier to focus on and move, and his theory that concentrating the flames into a tighter space increased their heat, the masked figure held up a hand for him to stop. Izuku realized with a flush of embarrassment he had been getting carried away again. Do you always take notes in such detail? Sensei asks. Izuku nods, feeling embarrassed. He got too enthusiastic. There is a moment of silence, as his teacher surveys him through the screen. Perhaps it would be better for you to show me what you know. He gestures to a shelf behind Izuku. There Izuku finds a box of matches, and a packet of candles. Trying to ignore the pain, but unable to stop himself from wincing, he sets up the candles in a circle. Izuku sits in the center, and strikes a match. It flares up in his fire sight, and he moves the flame off the head of the match, leaving the small stick of wood charred at the tip, and a tiny ball of flame hovering in midair. Like a man in meditation, he works on steadying his breathing, as he carefully directs the ball of flame, keeping it from growing any bigger or hotter. As he uses it to light the rest of the candles, one by one the burning wicks start to show in his fire sight. Without moving, he pinches up flames from the candle wicks without extinguishing them, drawing up fire to make the ball larger, as if he was winding up a ball of string. The streaming flames from each candle gather. 3 of them go out, and he spares a pinch of fire from his ball to relight them, working on his control. Then he tries putting the wicks out on purpose, and relighting them again. After he's certain he can choose to apply small flames, and extinguish them, he draws off part of his fireball to test his range. He sends out a ring of flame, as far as he can. Once it reaches the edge of his fire sight, and he loses control of it, the flames die. He draws up another ball of flame, and keeps it closer this time, as he experiments with shapes. He figures that the fire sight and his flame control are 2 interconnected things. The fire followed his thoughts. the mental image he had of it in his fire sight. The more he focused, the more precisely he could shape it. But if he had fire in two places, and focused more on one, the other would grow weaker, and extinguish without something to burn. He experimented with his ball of flames, compressing it down with his mind until it glowed white hot at the center, then stretching it out into a sheet that was comparatively cool, and twisting that into a whip that glowed at the center. He wraps it around one of the candles to test its heat, and the candle collapses in a puddle of molten wax that extinguishes the flame. Finally, he tries out a more complex shape, a dragon made of fire. Statically he builds it like a sculpture, but once he has it sculpted in detail, and tries to move it, he finds he can't concentrate on how each individual limb should move without forgetting how the other limbs go. A stabbing pain runs up to his shoulders, and the fire ends up going out. He reaches for more fire from the candles, and feels a twinge of pain, like the pain you got in your legs after running. Opening his eyes, and getting up, he feels his limbs are aching, as if he had spent far longer than he had in that position. He feels like he might be getting sick. The heat from the candles is making him sweaty, but his hands feel very weak, and there is an ache in his joints, as well as the pain from the burns. He guesses he could only control so much fire before his body gets tired. He wishes he had thought of something better to do than a dragon. Very good, his teacher says, as his demonstration ends. Have you given thought to how you would use this in combat? A bit. It wasn't a good idea though. Izuku looks at his bandaged hands. Flaming punches work best for those who had quirks that made their skin resistant to fire. Let me pose it as a question. How would you kill Endeavor? The figure on the screen asks. Izuku still stares down at his fingers. If he did fight the number 2 ranked hero, what would he do? He could probably control Endeavor's flames like he controlled Kaken, but Endeavor wore his flames as part of his costume. Izuku wouldn't be able to burn him, and in a one-on-one fight he would surely lose. Consider that your homework. When I next see you, I want to hear what your plan to kill Endeavor is. Class dismissed. The screen goes black, and Izuku carefully puts away the candles and matchbox. The one he melted to test his power is still a pool of hot wax, and he isn't sure how to clean it up or put it away. He looks hopelessly at it until a door opens from up the staircase, and Kurojiri comes down with a glass of orange juice for him, and to take him back. After his juice he says goodbye to everyone, and Kurojiri warps him back to the abandoned, but still nice-looking office they had told his mother was a therapist's office. Technically it belonged to the League who had rented it out, but none of the rooms were currently in use, just set up to look like they were. There he waited to be picked up and driven home. As he looks out the window he ponders the question Sensei had left him. Of course villains fought heroes, but he had never considered what would happen if he had to fight one. He mulls over the question over dinner, and goes to bed with stratagems crowding his head. It is the next day before he realizes he was so focused on showing off to Sensei that he could use the power he was given he didn't mention the other strange thing that happened. In the morning it is the weekend, and he has a visitor, battered and bruised, and waiting on his doorstep is Katsuki. There are patches on his cheeks covering up his burns, and his cheek has swollen up pretty badly. He glares at Izuku, as he stands in the doorway, and the hands shoved into his pockets ball into fists. Izuku meets his gaze, clearly showing he isn't intimidated. The burns on his hands ache. Katsuki looks away first, and, as he opens his mouth to speak, Izuku sees he is missing his canine tooth on the left side. He must have missed it in the blood, but he had knocked one of Kachin's teeth out. I want to talk to Izuku. Katsuki mumbles. Can I please come in? Izuku's mother looks towards him, and he nods. He wants to talk too. Katsuki shuffles inside, trying to avoid eye contact, and keeps his hands in his pockets. He is looking more than a little guilty. Izuku wasn't expecting to see him. Kaken had stopped coming around to his house to study a while ago, but not long enough for him to forget where Izuku's room was. I'll give you boys some snacks. Call me if you need anything, his mother says, and hesitantly leaves them alone. Izuku knows she'll be ready to intervene if they try fighting again, but he does genuinely want to talk. The door closes behind them. Izuku pulls his notebook off the bench, and closes it so Katsuki can't see his rough notes on how to kill Endeavor. What did you want to talk about, Kaken? He asks him, and slips the matchbox he had stolen from the kitchen into his palm. Katsuki looks at the ground with his fists, and lips trembling, his arms held stiffly by his sides. Give me back my quirk. He looks up, trying not to yell, and Izuku can see tears starting to form in his eyes. Izuku feels a stab of pity for him, but he hardens his heart, and channels his best impression of his mother giving him a scolding. You can have it back when you earn it, he says in his best prim and proper voice. A weekend without your quirk won't kill you. It didn't kill me. Katsuki grabs him by the front of his shirt. I said give it back. He snarls, and raises his fist. Izuku detonates a small explosion in his palm, and Kaken freezes. If my mom hears an explosion up here, Who do you think she's going to blame? He hisses. If my mother thinks you're here to fight, we might end up moving, and you'll never get your quirk back. Katsuki lets go, and Izuku straightens out his shirt. What do you want? Katsuki audibly sobs, furiously wiping his running eyes with his sleeve. I want to be your friend Kaken. Izuku says with genuine emotion. You're looking down on me. Katsuki sobs, staring at his feet, and trying not to cry. I am looking at you, Kaken. Izuku repeats his earlier words, and tries not to start crying, as well. I don't want us to be fighting all the time. I don't want to be someone you're always looking down on, and I don't want to look down on you. Please, can't we just be friends? He balls his fists. I want to be someone Kaken can acknowledge as strong. He sobs, and the tears are threatening to start flowing already. The two sniff in unison, both trying not to cry in front of the other, and they fight to clear the tears from their eyes first. I guess you did put up a decent fight, so it's not like you're totally useless, Katsuki confesses, choosing to stare at the ceiling rather than meet Izuku's eyes. And that's a pretty cool quirk with the fire, so I guess I can't really call you Deku anymore. Izuku's eyes light up. Really? I guess. Katsuki says sulkily, and mutters under his breath. I don't see why you hid such an amazing quirk though. Katsuki raises his head, his red eyes glowing with defiance. So will you give me back my quirk now? Oh, right. Izuku doesn't know how he took Katsuki's explosion quirk in the first place. He has some sort of instinctual understanding of it. He knows how taking it altered the structure of his sweat glands, and he knew how to trigger an explosion. He also knew that the skin on his palms had grown stronger, but he had already burned it before it could fully toughen. He had the same kind of knowledge about how his fire sight worked, but he had no idea how he had taken Kaken's explosion from him. He didn't even know if he could give it back. He tried to focus, but he couldn't figure out how to turn the sense of having the quirk into that little hot ball of power it was when he had first taken it. He would have to ask Sensei how he did it first, and he didn't have many reliable ways to reach the League. Besides, Kaken needed to unlearn some of his arrogance. He needed to be sure Katsuki wasn't going to go and start another fight as soon as he gave it back. What you said before, I want to hear you say it again at school. Then I know you're telling the truth. He sets his jaw determinedly. Now, do you want to do homework here or go home? Katsuki leaves before Izuku's mother comes back with snacks. At first he was scared. He admitted it. Unlike the natural ease that seemed to come with the flame control, he had no understanding of what his teacher had awakened in him. This unexplainable power that was his natural birthright. Everyone had trouble with their quirk. It was one of the unspoken laws of this society. One's abilities were something to grow into, something they spent their life learning, and, while the ability to control fire matched what could have been expected from his parents, his real quirk had been waiting inside him all along, waiting for something to awaken it, and when it had, he had inherited the earth. Izuku kind of wished Kaken had stayed around to do homework together like they used to, but if things worked out there would be time for that in the future. For now he tried to think of what he had done to take the quirk in the first place. It had been the same kind of sensation as when the quirk had been transferred to him, a ball of something hot, but not burning hot that he had taken like a jewel. He didn't have that sense anymore. He could detonate an explosion in the same way he could twitch his finger, but there was nothing about it that he could turn into that orb of power. He had lost that sensation of it when he had gained Katsuki's power. Izuku finished his homework before he rediscovered the little slip of paper, and made a call to the broker. It wasn't just his powers he had been practicing with. He had applied the furor he usually devoted to hero analysis to studying the League, as well, and he had learned a lot. He wasn't sure what the broker's quirk was, but the man only cared about money, and time was money. Izuku tried to keep their conversation short, but polite, so the broker could get back to his main business. From what he had pieced together from conversations, he probably wasn't meant to overhear the villain group that planned the heist had a drop spot near the playground. Kurojiiri had been investigating the actions of one of their agents around there when they had first met. This smaller villain organization had arranged to buy the Immutabilium back from the League of Villains, and that the broker was negotiating terms. The League was taking 10% in salvage rights, from the briefcase, not from the payment, because Sensei had found a way to trace down the creator of the alloy using it. Once he took their quirk, the League would have control of the supply, and the Hero Association would soon be unable to use it for constructing costume. It must be tough work negotiating with other villain groups, Izuku thought, as he politely asked if there was a way he could speak with Sensei. It turned out there wasn't. Sensei didn't have much contact with the outside world. He was more of a fugitive than most villains, though Izuku wasn't sure what he did that merited being so careful. Most high-profile villains, even ones from the past, were well known enough to have their own fan pages. Sensei being skilled and deadly enough to not be known at all to the wider world, but still wanted by heroes, meant he was either a new villain or a very old one. Izuku was leaning towards the latter, There was an air of experience about Sensei that a villain who hadn't done anything yet could never hope to match. If there was anyone to ask about this, it would be Sensei, for his experience, as well as his quirk. One of the things Izuku had learnt that he probably shouldn't have was that the number Kurogyri had given him was unlisted. Thanks to an exploit in the way the phone system worked, it didn't really exist. There were no charges for its use, no way for it to be tracked or recorded, and no way to contact them after the number was discarded. It was his only point of contact with the League, but not their only contact with him. The broker put him through to Kurogyri's phone, and he tried to explain the situation properly without sounding too obvious about it in case his mother overheard. It didn't help that he didn't quite understand the situation himself or how to explain it, but Kurogyri patiently put up with his panicked ramblings until he got the point. Let me see if I am understanding you correctly. Kurogyri's calm voice tells him. You are saying that you seem to have acquired a second quirk after your fight with your friend, and you wish to know how you did so you can return it? I'm afraid that is not something I can personally help you with. In fact, it would be wise for you to come in immediately to discuss it. Can you make an excuse to your mother for your absence? Izuku nods, then remembers that it can't be seen over the phone. Yes, we will have to get you a phone of your own too. You should have contacted us earlier about this. Kurogyri seems to be making a mental note. Leave, as soon as possible, and I will open a warp gate for you. Kurogyri gives him a precise direction, and time, as he always did, and Izuku shoves his notebooks into his bag to try, and make it look like he is packed for study, and slings the bag over his shoulder. I'm going to catch up with Kaken, they'll be back for dinner. He calls out, and runs out the door. Ah, Izuku! His mother calls out to him, but he is already through the door, and heading down the street. He doesn't see the look of sadness in her eyes, as the door closes behind him. She fears she is losing her son to something she doesn't understand, and can't control, but Izuku is too caught up to notice her pain. Izuku keeps an eye on his watch, as he makes his way off the main street. Kurogyri was always punctual when he was opening a warp gate, but he had confessed he needed a definite location. He couldn't see where the warp gate opened, so he put them in out-of-the-way locations. It reduced the risk of accidentally bisecting someone by opening a warp gate on top of them. As Kurogyri had confessed, he hated getting filth mixed up in his body. Traveling by warp gate was something Izuku didn't think he would get used to, but it is already feeling as natural as stepping onto a train. He steps out into the bar, and takes a moment to adjust to the dimmer lighting from the bright sunny day outside. The bar is empty apart from his teacher, Kurogyri. Their eyes on him makes Izuku start to sweat with nervousness. Stepping out of the warp gate felt like stepping onto a stage, and seeing the audience waiting without knowing what it was you were supposed to be saying. Thank you? He politely thanks Kurogyri, as he reforms. It was a necessary evil, his teacher replies. In the simple cozy atmosphere of the bar he loomed like an angel of death. Your presence was urgently required. He gestures. Now sit, and tell me what you told Kurogyri, but in greater detail. Izuku sits, and goes over the events of the past few days, starting from when he had been given his quirk, and detailing the fight he had in more detail than he had first reported it. He tries to detail more than the physical actions he took, but the feelings that had overcome him, as if it could explain how he had taken Katsuki's quirk from him. His teacher waits opposite until his story stammers to a stop, as unreadable as his metal mask. Izuku has no idea what he is thinking or what he is going to say or do. He is afraid he might have somehow disappointed him by not saying this sooner, or everyone might think he was lying for attention or anything really. 1,000 gruesome scenarios play out in his mind, as silence falls. Did I do it wrong? He timidly asks, desperate for some sort of sign. Again there is no reply. His hands bunched at his sides start to tremble, and a cold sweat runs down the back of his neck. The tiny spark of flame in the lit cigarette crumpled in the ashtray seems to grow brighter, and brighter in his fire sight, urging him to take control of it, and defend himself. I should have recognized the signs earlier, his teacher says to himself. Izuku, do you know what a quirk is? And it's a natural ability caused by a mutation. He stammers. Technically, the term quirk refers to the mode-off express mutation, his teacher tells him. The term quirk covers the wide range of biological changes from what can be considered a baseline human. Even though the naming trait is considered dominant, a quirk includes a series of other mutations that allow the ability to be expressed without harming the inheritor. Do you understand? And maybe? Izuku stammers. Is that like how Kaken can use his explosions without burning himself? I would say so. Sensei rises from his seat. Izuku, my quirk, the All-for-One, has a few what you might call secondary abilities that allow me to use it. The first of those is quirk analysis, an instinctive understanding and curiosity towards the quirks of others that allows me to use a quirk I have taken. You have that ability. I have what? Izuku stammers. It was a possibility I had not planned for, but an inability to adapt lost me one empire, and I will not have it lose me a second one. His teacher extends a hand to him. This is not the first time a quirk I have been given has revealed a valuable mutation, but this time I will not let it be turned against me. Izuku, it is time I told you the history of my power, the history of our power, the All for One. And Izuku had sat slack-jawed with amazement, as he had been told the story of the two quirks, the All for One, and the One for All, and realized how much of what he had thought had been false. To him a quirk had always been a natural thing. Getting born with a good quirk was like being born into a wealthy family. It was a biological lottery. Yeah, had known that quirks didn't used to be as widespread as they were, but it wasn't until he heard it from his teacher that he understood what it must have been like living in those times. His teacher had been a god among men in the time before the Age of Heroes, where people tore each other apart in the streets out of fear and envy of those who had been born different. It sounded like a bloody storm of chaos and death, in which his teacher has risen like a phoenix to create a new order. It had been a dark time, all knew it, but in that time his teacher, All for One, had shaped the world around him. A time so long in the past the fact that such a figure was standing in front of him filled him with awe. It was one thing to be told he had been born with a quirk. It was another to be told that the quirk he was born with had never been expressed because he had never thought of one as something that could be gained. There were times in his life where he had really thought he had been cursed for being born without a quirk, and now it turned out he had inherited the most amazing one possible. Izuku would be lying if he said turning the tables on those who had bullied him hadn't felt like justice in this unfair world. It was a stunning revelation that he had to wrap his head around, that he, the quirkless reject, had the power to rule the world if he learned how to use it. Abilities he had inherited. When he was younger he had played at being other heroes, experiencing through the magic of make-believe what it would be like to have a hero's quirk, and now they were all at his fingertips, ready for the taking. It was a heady rush of power. What would have happened if he had never met his teacher? Would he have lived the rest of his life believing he was quirkless? If he did discover its abilities later on, would he ever be able to use them? He was lucky indeed to be born into a time where he could meet and be taught by another holder of this power. Then he had been told the truth about All Might, and another little piece of his innocence slipped away. The symbol of peace was a figure that was never questioned, at least not in that way. And Izuku felt a little more fortunate finding out that the hero admired by millions the world over had been born quirkless. All his powers, the mysterious quirk often debated about on the internet, all of this was the result of his teacher's abilities. The real All Might was weak and dying. It was something he could barely comprehend. The mental image of All Might everyone had was of a figure of unsurpassed strength, an image his teacher now told him was a carefully constructed lie. This society balanced on the edge of collapse, and the symbol of peace was the one who tried to hold it up. As long as people believed in the lie that a hero would always be there to save them, it absolved them from the responsibility of thinking for themselves. A person is smart. People are dumb, dangerous, panicky animals, and if something ever happened to shock them out of their complacence, they would realize that the quirks they all held could be used as weapons. All it would take is for the symbol of peace to fall, and everyone would realize how frail their beliefs had been. Then All for One had told him about Tamura, for whom the heroes had never come, and Izuku felt a stab of sympathy for the teen covered in hands. There was something alike about them. They had both been forgotten by a society that acted like it was perfect. They were lost and ignored while people pretended like everything was fine. They were both people who didn't get heroes. All for One had asked him to stay and be taught alongside him. He wanted Tamura to have a friend he could talk to, and Izuku was more than willing to try if it would help. After all, his teacher had said he wanted his successors to get along with each other. It meant more lessons here in how to use his new abilities, lessons that were started soon after. Physical contact was the key. It was easier if touching the head, but any part of the body would work. If he could hold them, he could find that hot ball that was the center of their power, and draw it into himself, and make it his. The power was his, as long as he focused on it. Quirks he wasn't using would shuffle out of the way according to his prioritization, so abilities he wasn't using would wait ready for him to call on them. When he used his quirk on someone, he created a connection with them that drew their abilities into him. With focus he could reverse that connection to send the power back. He had to focus and pull back the sensation of the power from his extremities, like peeling back a shed skin, until that power was concentrated in his core. Then the ball of energy was his to reabsorb or pass on. His teacher told him that when he was older and more experienced, he wouldn't need to make physical contact to do this. He would be able to see that ball of power and take it from a distance, as well as force the activation of a quirk by stimulating it with his mind. Taking quirks of the same type meant he could combine them into a stronger version of themselves that acted as one quirk, whereas giving multiple quirks to someone caused the quirk to mutate and fuse, sometimes in unpredictable ways. That was how his teacher had created the One for All, a quirk that passed down the strength of every previous holder, the quirk of All Might. The greatest hero in the world had been created, by accident, by this man who stood in front of him, and called them the same. It was a lot to take in. All for One had clapped him on the shoulder, and told him he was stronger than he had ever thought possible. With that, Izuku was sent home to rest, and make plans for the future, and then double-check the total, and you should be done, Kurojairi tells him. Izuku scribbles down the last few digits, and checks over his workings, muttering under his breath, as he does so. Once he's sure he's got it right, he looks up, and smiles. Thank you for all your help, he bows politely. It was no trouble, Kurojairi replies. Tamura looks up, and waves the console held between a thumb and 2 fingers. Izuku draws out the name long, and droning. Look what I... Huh! Izuku squints at the screen. You managed to get to level 9? That's amazing, Tamura-senpai. Tamura chuckles. Want to know how I did it? He says with a grin. Yeah. Izuku nods emphatically. Tamura jerks his head to indicate he wants Izuku to come over to him, and returns his attention to the console. Izuku's face falls. Sorry, I have school. Tamura snorts. But that's boring. He holds the game console with his pinky fingers extended, as far back as they can go. You should stop being boring. We can play after school, he tells Tamura. Try not to get too far ahead without me. Have fun being bored then. Tamura lazily waves in acknowledgement, and Izuku steps out. This was among the more useful quirks he had acquired, the Flash Step, an instant teleportation quirk. It allowed someone to move from any location to a location that was familiar to them without moving through the in-between space. The jolt of sudden movement used to make him throw up, but he had quickly learned how to keep the lurching in his stomach under control. He had felt bad for making Kurojairi transport him everywhere, so one of the first quirks he had stolen was a transportation one. Because it only worked to teleport him to places he was familiar with, he could use it to get to the bar without knowing where exactly it was. He's sure by now he was trusted, but he liked having that bit of distance in case he was ever captured. Time had passed, as time did, sweeping you along with it so subtly you barely noticed it carrying you towards death. Izuku had grown older, and perhaps wiser, and the pain that had been so sharp in his past had mellowed with time. He had stopped cowering and stammering. Now he moved, and spoke with an easy confidence. The anger that had sparked that first fight burned hidden in his chest, prompting him to action in situations where his past self would have cowered. He had tried things that would have scared him before, and found himself enjoying them. Slowly, but steadily he had become a leader in the class, someone his schoolmates looked up to, and asked for help, and he enjoyed that. Izuku was one of the popular kids now. He had friends who he talked to, and spent time with. Now he wasn't held back by his formerly crippling insecurity. His best friend was still Kaken, despite Kachen's enduring reputation as a hoodlum. They still walked to and from school together, and hung out on the weekends. In class they had their seats close to each other, and competed on everything from exams to the sports festival. Whenever one of them was first, the other would be second, and swore next time they were going to make the number 1 spot until most of the class was silently competing for third place rather than get mixed up in their rivalry. Anyone looking at them would think that he was the brains, and Kaken was the brawn. Because his flame control quirk was psychic rather than physical in nature, Izuku didn't have to train his body to use it. Though he had joined the judo club for the training in close combat he would need, as a hero, it hadn't really reflected in his physique. Kaken had gone all out on the physical training, and it showed. Izuku had asked him to join the judo club with him, but Kaken had opted to join the boxing club instead of lingering with the other members of the going home early club like a delinquent. Even without his quirk he could take someone out with a single punch, but it was a mistake to think of him as unintelligent because of it. Izuku knew that under all that hair Kaken was really quite smart. Had started to think before he rushed into a dangerous situation. Of course he had rushed in anyway, but that was just Kaken being Kaken, and he wasn't going to try and change that. He was still as grumpy as he had been when they were kids, but Izuku knew he had a good heart. He hadn't had to confiscate his quirk for months. The threat of it was enough to keep Kaken in line. At any time, he could take Kachen's quirk from him. He didn't have to see him to do it. He didn't even have to know where he was. Unlike his fire sight, the connection he had made with his power, the All for One 2.0, didn't fade over distance. All he had to do was focus on drawing the ability back to him to rob Kaken of his quirk, and he made sure Kaken knew it. Through the league he had eyes and ears everywhere, and he made sure Kaken knew if he was caught acting in an unheroic manner punishment would be swift. It hadn't taken him long to learn his lesson. It had taken longer for him to let go of his resentment. Kaken was proud. It had taken time to get him to submit. But now they finally felt like equals. Hey Zucken, if you don't hurry up we're going to be late. Katsuki calls out to him. It'll be right there Kaken. Izuku yells back, as he puts his notebooks in his bag. 2 were for school, the 3rd was a plain covered volume for hero analysis. He covered not just heroes that were popular now, but retired heroes who had also been great in the past, looking for what it was that made them so. A few names had been carefully crossed out in red ink. Katsuki was waiting outside the door, slouched with his hands in his pockets, and a dour expression that brightened once he saw Izuku. You don't have to be so impatient Kaken. Izuku tells him. We'll get there in plenty of time, even if we walk slowly. Yeah, but I heard there was an incident near you might want to check out first. Katsuki shoves his hands back in his pockets. Where is it? Izuku asks excitedly, and Katsuki laughs. Your eyes really light up when you say that you damn nerd. He reaches out, and ruffles Izuku's hair to mild protests. This way. There are already heroes on the scene by the time they manage to make their way to the front of the crowd. Izuku takes care to try and identify each one, even those that are holding back. He tries to memorize how they are using their quirks to deal with the situation. The villain is a large mutant type, but not that good at strategizing. Sensei would want information on the hero's response for the Numa projects. Sukin, you're muttering again. Katsuki tells him, and Izuku jumps in surprise. It was easier for him to catalog his thoughts when he spoke aloud, but it was a bad habit of his. Any hero that could amplify sounds had a chance to decipher what he was saying, and that would endanger the league. Sorry, I'm just excited to be able to see heroes fight. Izuku apologizes to him. Are you one of those hero fans? A man near the front of the crowd asks them. Yup. Katsuki replies without hesitation, and claps his hand on Izuku's shoulders. He is. Mean, Kaken. Izuku sighs. We're students going into a heroics course, so it's good to be able to see how professional heroes operate. Katsuki tugs at his sleeve, and Izuku instantly returns his attention to the scene. The heroes are making a move. He identifies one, Kamui Woods, as making his move with his signature technique to restrain one with a thumping that bounced him slightly into the air. The oversized villain was taken down by a more oversized woman in an incredibly tight-fitting suit. Izuku makes a face. There was no teamwork between them, and with that outfit Izuku is sure this debut hero is just pandering to the fans. What do you think of Kaken? He asks. Kill stealing. Katsuki uses the video game term, as he crosses his arms behind his head, and tries to avoid looking at Izuku or the massive rump taking up half the skyline. Is Kaken blushing? Izuku teases him back. Shut it, nerd. Katsuki snorts, but Izuku is sure he did spy a flush of red in his cheeks. We're going to be late. Right. Izuku says to himself with a smile, knowing they were still going to make it to school in time. They make it into the classroom, and find their respective seats before the bell rings. Izuku gets out his hero analysis book too, and makes a few notes on this newcomer. On the surface that giant growth looked like a strong quirk, but Izuku could think of many downsides to taking it. The pointless property damage, the fact that your strength remained proportional, the massive target you became, an unknown duration. The real question was how could it be countered? Zucken, class is starting. Katsuki warns him. Right. Izuku puts away his notebook, ready to focus on his lessons. You're all in 3rd grade now. It's time to be thinking of your futures. Their teacher snaps. I've got this career aptitude test to give you. He tosses the papers up in the air. But you're all wanting to go to the heroics course, right? There is an answering cheer, as nearly every member of class demonstrates their quirks in a show of pride. Izuku, not wanting to steal the thunder of his flame-producing classmates, drums his fists on his desk while Katsuki just leans back in his chair and smiles. Well, everyone here has strong quirks, their teacher says. Just remember that use of your quirks outside of school is forbidden. I've got some information here for you on the heroics courses available. PSH, I don't need that. Katsuki snorts, and leans back in his chair, offering one clenched fist behind him. We're going to Yui, right Sucken? Right. Izuku says with his face screwed up in determination, and bumps knuckles with the offered fist. That national high school? You need a 79 in all your exams to enter, right? A girl at the front of the class asks. I heard the entrance exams are cutthroat, as well. The boy beside her adds. But if it's those two they just might do it. Izuku doesn't see who says that, but their classmates are all crowding around with questions at once. Katsuki smirks proudly at the attention his statement has gathered while Izuku hides his face on his desk, and wishes his best friend wasn't such a bonehead. Yeah, they had both been planning to go to Yui High School. They were the best students in the class, so they would both want to go to the best high school. It was just the way Kaken said it that made him embarrassed. Their goals were the same. They both wanted to surpass All Might, and each other, and take the number 1 hero spot. It was a rivalry they'd had since they were kids, and they both worked hard to try and beat the other. You could always try, and apply too. He suggests a bit timidly to the sea of attentive faces. Nah, none of this lot are suited for Yui. Katsuki says dismissively, and Izuku watches the admiration turn to anger. What do you mean by that? A few members of the class start rocking his chair to try and make him fall. Are you looking down on us? One of them yells. I'm just being honest, Katsuki yells at them, and a few sparks fly from his palms in anger. Come on Zukin, hurry up, and save me from this unruly mob. Izuku leans over, his face completely serious. Long live the king. He kicks the supporting leg of Katsuki's chair, and he tumbles off it. Okay, that's enough. Everyone get back to your seats, and settle down. Bakugo, sit properly, the teacher scolds. No one is going to be going anywhere if you don't study for the entrance exams. Right. Bakugo sighs, as he sits, and class moves on. It is nearing the end of their peaceful middle school days, but Izuku is already looking ahead to the future. General education was required, but a school specializing in heroics would be the best place for him to study. There were bound to be many aspiring heroes with interesting quirks for him to investigate, and take if need be. Of course he had backup plans, but Yui would be the best place to put the next step of All for One's plans into action. Izuku had a couple more questions about the Yui entrance exams for the teachers, so he told Katsuki to go on ahead to the arcade. His teacher didn't know much about the Yui exams apart from there being a physical and written exam, so despite his best questions he didn't end up learning much. With a sigh he decides to catch up to Katsuki. He has both exams to train for over the next few months, but he still wants to spend time with both his friends. He is waiting, pondering if it would be worth using Flash Step to get to the arcade if Katsuki is that far ahead of him when there is a loud boom and a rising pillar of black smoke. Izuku breaks into a run. He knew that sound, and he knew that cloud. Flames start to blaze in the surrounding area, as more explosions sound, growing progressively louder and closer together. His fire sight is nearly bright enough to blind him, as he dives into the crowd. His first panic thought was that Kaken had somehow gone on a rampage, but, as he fights his way to see what's going on, he realizes the situation is much worse. The figure trying to force its way through the street is a large flowing mass of what looks like a viscous liquid with eyeballs. Katsuki is trying to fight his way free, detonating desperate explosions as he does so, but the villain's liquid form is still clinging to him and suffocating him, as he is dragged back to be used as a human shield. The first thing that runs through Izuku's head at lightning speed is disgust. All these people here, crowding around, are doing nothing to help. There is a crisis in front of them that they could all solve if they worked together, and instead they cluster like flies around garbage, complaining about how no one else had done anything. It was pathetic, and made him feel sick. There was so much human waste to be willing to watch and do nothing. The heroes weren't any better. They were on the scene trying to douse the fires and evacuate the herd of human cattle, but none of them wanted to be responsible for saving his friend. As soon as they saw the situation wasn't one tilted in their favor, they gave up on even trying. Pathetic, Izuku thinks, as he leaps the barrier. You're all so pathetic. Couldn't they see the look in Kaken's eyes? Couldn't they see the pain they were capable of preventing, and chose not to? Kaken! He screams out to his friend. He felt that anger, that hot cutting flame in his heart, as he reached out with his fire sight. They'd been told to stop doing this before. They'd both been scolded for jumping into fights instead of waiting for the heroes to show up. But Izuku couldn't stand seeing others suffer, and Kaken liked the fight. This time his friend was the one in danger. If a hero tried to hold him back now, Izuku wasn't sure he could stop from hurting them too. About a third of the fires seem to snuff themselves out, as Izuku gathers their flames. Katsuki's red eyes, wide with despair, and already gathering tears, turn towards him, and he makes a quick hand gesture he knows Kaken will recognize. Katsuki squeezes his eyes shut, and Izuku concentrates all the flames he has gathered, and sends them at the villain's eyes. The white-hot ball of flame hits, and sizzles in the fluid. The thick greenish goop swallows the flames, and extinguishes them, but the bright light is enough to daze the villain, and Izuku closes the rest of the distance. He grabs at Katsuki's freed hand, his friend's fingers closing tight around his own, and pulls with all his strength and knowledge of leverage. He tries to haul Katsuki over his shoulder like he was going to throw him rather than try to pull him free from brute strength. The green goo sticks like cement, far heavier than it looked, but too fluid to properly damage with his hands. Despite the exhaustion that set in when he was manipulating large amounts of fire, he reached out again, and drew up as much flame as he could carry. The strain caused a pulse of pain in his heart, but the rest of the fires went out. Rather than a sphere that would be extinguished, he focuses the flames into a legion of red-hot spears that all glow white with compressed heat. A faint blue glow around them makes them appear like spears of electricity rather than flames. But even suspended in midair, the heat they gave off was starting to melt the tarmac. He directs each one into the side of the body that is holding Kaken before the villain has a chance to recover. They hit one after the other, extinguishing, as they are doused in the viscous fluid of the villain's body, but hitting with enough force to start to separate the material, and the heat is strong enough to prevent the goop from sticking back together. Even though it feels like he might have a heart attack, he keeps building up the flames, as he fires flaming spear after flaming spear into the villain's squishy body until the pressure against him eases enough for him to be able to pull Katsuki free with a loud squelch. Katsuki falls to his knees, clawing at his face, as he nearly vomits trying to cleanse the muck from his mouth. Izuku catches him before he can hit the floor, but the villain has recovered from the dazzling, and Izuku realizes that after he freed Kaken he stopped focusing on his spears. Embers smolder around him, but they are dead in his fire sight, and with a roar the mass of green goo opens a mouth lined with tombstone teeth, and lurches towards them. Then it exploded. Izuku, with the shaking Kaken over one shoulder, had found himself reaching for a quirk he wasn't supposed to have one moment, and the next watching green muck rain briefly from the sky. The figure standing in the same space the villain had been occupying was one he couldn't fail to recognize. All Might. Hiding behind a human shield won't save you from a villain, he says and laughs. It is the first time Izuku has seen the legendary symbol of peace up close, and he is struck by how incredibly staged this all feels. Fake. Plastic. Hollow. He looks at the crowd, and how they cheer him, and how he in turn validates them for being useless. That smile, that line, that casual display of power that should terrify, but instead sparks admiration. It feels vapid to him. He wasn't the one who saved Kaken. If no one had come, if Kaken had suffocated to death instead, would anyone be blamed? Or would it just be an unfortunate tragedy? Izuku looks at the hero's back, and feels a fraction of his teacher's resentment. You hold them back with this lie, he thinks. He holds Katsuki close to him, and feels him tremble. You act like you will save us all, he thinks, but you can't. The weight of this world lies on your shoulders, and it is crushing you slowly. Izuku and I couldn't do anything, Katsuki says in a low, trembling whisper. Even with my quirk. And he's ignoring that. Izuku thinks, a smile, and a thumbs up, and he thinks everything is over. But of course, after you see this enough you can numb yourself. Now then, how are you holding up, young man? All Might finally turns towards them, as Izuku helps Katsuki to his feet. That was a reckless thing you did running in like that. The symbol of peace waggles a finger at him. It feels like a pantomime skit, but it was brave. All Might puts a hand on his shoulder. You've got the heart of a hero. Years ago those words would have made him swell with pride. Now they rung hollow. Really, sir, Katsuki deserves the praise. He held his own, and fought his hardest against an impossible-to-beat opponent. I just rushed in to save my friend, Izuku admits. Under other circumstances he would have claimed credit, but he can tell Katsuki is spooked. Perhaps the attention would prevent his friend from fixating on his own moment of helplessness. He felt helpless, and scared Katsuki. All Might seemed to be good at convincing the helpless they had value, so he left his friend in All Might's hands, and slipped off. All Might's punch had splattered the villain with air pressure, but Izuku had unfinished business with him. Paparazzi crowded around All Might while the few useless heroes resigned themselves to cleaning up the gunk. They missed the small grimy side alley though, and Izuku immediately slipped in there, and concealed himself. A large chunk of the viscous goo was gathering there. Two round eyes suspended in the muck glaring, as the villain tried to recover enough of his substance to flee. Izuku crept up behind him, and put his hand in the goo. It was cold, and thick, but even for a mutant type there was that same hot core of power. You've interfered with my business, he says coldly, as the puddle of goo tries to suck him in. Huh! The villain tries to turn his eyes to see him. Katsuki Bakugo is my property, and I will not forgive you for endangering him so recklessly, Izuku says calmly, as he puts on his villain costume. It was a combination of quirks that changed his voice, and hid his face. What can you do? The villain laughs, confident in the ability of his liquid form to negate damage. Heh. What can I do? Izuku smirks, looking over the array of quirks he had at his disposal. Most were taken from villains foolish enough to stand against the League of Villains. Some were taken from retired heroes. If he wanted to destroy this blob of filth in front of him, it would be far too easy. You're not worth killing, so I'm going to take your quirk. He closes his fingers on the ball of energy even a mutant type couldn't hide. You're going to spend the rest of your life in a bottle, you pathetic puddle of piss. I want you to live, and suffer, and curse your fate, as a warning to others of what happens when you cross me. He takes the quirk, and feels the goo that was trying to claw its way up his arm quiver, and starts to fall. And if anyone asks, say the name of the one who did this was all for one. He menacingly whispers to the collapsing puddle, as he takes the ability to manipulate his liquid form fully away from the villain, and he dissolves, leaving him either unconscious or dead. Izuku rejoins the crowd with no sign he had ever been gone. He would be the arbiter of this world. That was the thing he had told all for one he wanted to be. They had talked, and Izuku had told him honestly about his frustrations, and his fears, and his dreams for the future, even his fears that he was too weak and soft-hearted to repay his teacher for what he had done. His teacher had told him it was alright to aim for being a hero if he was doing it for the right reasons, to be a figure that was respected and feared, as the one that determined justice. The ruler of the masses unquestioned in authority was a respectable goal. A villain was best served by appearing to be not one. He must just never question that he was superior to them, and that his mercy, his kindness, was a show of his strength, not of his obligation. He was not owned by the people. He was not a slave of the masses to attend to their every need, and be content in his slavery. He was a ruler to be loved and feared by his people because it was by his hand alone that justice was administered. Those that respected him would be rewarded. Those that acted against him would be destroyed in their entirety, as an example. That was the path he had chosen to walk. That was his path of a hero. Time was ticking down until the Yi entrance exams. In the mornings he pored over his studies, dedicatedly devoting himself to his studies to ace the written exam. In the afternoons he trained his body, and quirked with the rest of the league. Sensei was planning something. There had always been a few hangers-on in the league, henchmen, as Izuku thought of them, as doing odd jobs for cash or the thrill, but recently they had been mobilizing. Sensei had the quirk that produced immutabilium now, and a few black market experts had been called in to try and create some sort of body armor out of it. Naturally, since Sensei was the one with the quirk now, the availability of the rare quirk nullifying metal had shrunk even further, so there were questions of who it was actually worth outfitting. Kurogiri had the metallic plates he wore, as a collar fortified by it. But, as for anything else, there was a question of whether it was worth outfitting the cannon fodder. Izuku spent time with all of them, trying to see what he could learn from them before they were sent off. Tamura ignored them all, but he had told his senpai that you could learn something even from the most powerless of them. A bit of flattery from the boy who bought them their drinks was generally enough for them to teach him something new, and had picked up a few good skills. This was how you broke out of handcuffs. This was how you broke out of a straitjacket. This was how you broke a chokehold. This was how you broke a nose. Izuku was always entertainingly bad at first to give them something to laugh about, then honed his skills to deadly perfection in his own time. Let them think he was harmless for now. It would make it easier to take them out if he needed to. How to plant a false trail, how to hide a body, how to blend into a crowd. Any successful criminal had knowledge that couldn't be found in schools, and were willing to pass it on. He had learned how to fight, not fair, but to win. When someone's hands were around your throat, and there was murder in their eyes, you didn't care about winning honorably. You cared about getting them down, and not letting them get up. Improvised weapons, blackjacks, brass knuckles, switchblades, baseball bats, these were all tools villains had taught him how to use. Izuku was under no delusions about the limits of his power. The flame control quirk was a mid-ranged one. He had trained hard to extend its range to 30 meters, but that was the utmost limit. He couldn't throw fire from a distance because it would extinguish once it hit the 30-meter mark, and he couldn't have much fire within a meter of him without risk of overheating, blinding or burning himself. That meant he had to be able to defend himself in close quarters without it. Of course, he had all the quirks he had taken at his fingertips in case the flame control failed him, but he practiced with those on his own time. Every fight he had gotten into, he could destroy them with his stolen powers, but then he would also have to kill the witnesses to keep his ability a secret. Not much use for a hero. His training was split into two aspects. His training to be a hero was half about researching other heroes to understand why they were popular, and how they used their abilities, and half about training himself to withstand the grueling path of the hero. His villain training was half about identifying quirks he wanted, and planning how to take them, and half learning how to injure someone so greatly they would never recover, as a show of power. Both were largely about appearances. How did you have to act to get someone to respond the way you wanted? He made sure to keep his mind and body both in peak condition, ready for whatever the exam would throw at him, and trying to cover every angle, but quietly confident that he would succeed. In the time before the exams he had acquired another 3 quirks, all of them from retired heroes. Retired heroes were the easiest to take quirks from. The quirks themselves hadn't faded in power since their glory days, but retirees seldom used them, and never noticed when they were taken. Those from the golden age of heroes, so changed from the images of them immortalized in history, were never suspicious about a kind young man offering to help them cross the road or carry their groceries. The elderly often had trouble with their quirks. It wasn't suspicious at all for them to fade entirely. He hadn't seen Katsuki for a while. Of course Kaken would be working hard on his own. It wasn't like they had much spare time for hanging out and getting ice cream, and they had spared so often it wasn't much practice for a real fight. Still, he was concerned that Katsuki had been shaken after being captured by that villain. He had been very subdued the last time Izuku saw him, which was a cause for concern in itself. He had told him he could have his quirk for the entire time, and wished him luck on the exams, and they hadn't really spoken since. Well, he was sure that he would get to see him during the exams. Kaken was his rival. They were both going to pass. Maybe they'd be in the same class again. Izuku woke up on the day of the exam, kissed his mother goodbye, and set off with a smile on his face. The school building itself was very impressive, and he felt a surge of pride in himself for reaching this point. The future ahead of him was looking bright, and he was going to reach it no matter what. During the written exam he wrote so much it gave him a friction burn on his writing fingers, and he was still scribbling down the last few words when time was up. He hoped it didn't reflect badly on his grade. He was still worrying about it, as they were shown into the briefing room for the practical exam, but his nervousness lifted, as he saw his seat number was next to Katsuki. Of course, discussing the exam was forbidden, so he smiles, and silently hopes they both did well in the written test. The lights dim, and everyone's view is riveted towards the stage, as the voice hero present Mike steps up to explain the exam. Izuku is so busy focusing on analyzing the exam for any amount of leverage he barely pays attention to the radio-famous hero, beside the occasional wince at his volume. "What do you think of Kaken?" he asks, partially out of habit. "Seems biased towards combat-heavy quirks." Katsuki snorts. "Looks like we'll be taking the test in different places." Izuku examines the numbers in front of them. "Good luck, Kaken." "I don't need luck." Katsuki snorts. "I'm going to get the highest score in this exam." He flicks Izuku's forehead. "So you better not fail or I'm disowning you, as a rival." "Mean Kaken." Izuku rubs at the spot. A person ahead of them raises his hand, and stands up shortly afterwards. "There are 4 kinds of villains listed on the handout." He starts to protest. Izuku has to resist the desire to roll his eyes. Present Mike obviously hasn't finished explaining the test. He should have waited until he was sure the question wasn't going to be addressed before speaking up. "And you?" The young aspiring hero points towards Izuku and Katsuki. "Stop talking during the presentation. Do you want to go?" Katsuki yells back. "I'll take you on right here, right now." "Wow, loving your enthusiasm there." Present Mike tries to regain control of the situation, and Izuku tugs Kaken back into his seat. A villain with no point value was interesting. A hazard had no reason to be classified on the sheet as a villain. Something like simulating a natural disaster in the area would be enough for that. How would they set up an enemy as undefeatable enough that there would be no point in trying? It seems like a strange addition for the hero course, and Izuku knows he's not the only one trying to work out the trick. The points-based scoring system was very simple. Its stated priority would be given to those with quirks that let them locate and defeat many opponents in a short space of time. But were they really going to use that alone, as a judge of heroics? Analyze, find the weakness, find the trick that makes it all understandable. He is thinking of that. As with the last few words of inspiration they move towards the exam grounds. He feels his heart getting lighter the closer they get towards the examination grounds. This is the final hurdle, the point where he either makes it in or fails completely. But instead of feeling nervous, he is raring to go. He wouldn't say it out loud, but he was hoping he could have had the test with Kaken. They made a great team when they were fighting together. Present Mike's quirk-enhanced voice ripples across the area. "What are you waiting for? Real life doesn't come with a countdown, you know." Izuku sprints towards the entrance with the rest of the group. They're sandwiched pretty tight near the entrance, so there's a few moments where he can let the crowd carry him along before they disperse enough for him to flick out his lighter and start summoning fire. He surrounds himself with a halo-like circle of fire as he starts to run. He skids around the corner, and a robot with a big number 1 painted on each shovel-like arm charges at him from down the street. He breaks the circle of flames into 1 whip-like length and slashes open its head. The robot explodes with a gout of flame he adds to his stock, and another 2 robots with the numbers 2 and 3 start to come at him from the sides. After dispatching them, Izuku works to analyze his surroundings, trying to figure out the patterns of the robots to determine how to draw them to him. The robots are actively hunting them down, so the best way to find them is to find where the other examinees were gathering. They would be rushed en masse, so part of this test was how well you can respond to multiple enemies, as well as the competition from the other examinees. This looked like a poor test of heroics on the surface. Things like cooperation and a greater good were just hollow dress-ups, weren't they, when the competition was based on who could keep someone else from succeeding. For every 10 points he gets, he creates another blazing orb to circle him. A hair-thin circle of flames no bigger than candle flames runs the circumference of his fire sight. While they blazed brightly enough to be a warning to the other humans in the area, the robots were too fixated on their mission to care if they broke the circle. It meant he couldn't be crept up on. As soon as something mechanical broke the boundary, he would send the spheres to annihilate it. He fell into a comfortable pattern, concerned only with keeping an accurate count, until the rumbling of breaking buildings gave him a reason to look upward. Course hazard. Izuku now understands what the 0-point villain was supposed to represent. That was the kind of powerful villain heroes needed to band together to defeat, even if there was no personal gain for themselves, and they were fleeing. Izuku ran counter to the crowd like a fish swimming against a waterfall, and found behind the rush, as always, are people left behind. Heroes. He runs to the aid of the injured, a cute-looking girl who has fallen over. Rubble pins her legs. Can you stand? He asks quickly. My legs, she starts to say, and a shadow falls over them. The massive hulk of metal towers over them. Izuku thinks about a word he learned from Kaken, and gathers his flames. Hold on, they'll get you out of there. He looks up at the looming metal behemoth. You're going to fight that? She grabs his ankle. It'll be fine. Izuku tries to reassure her, as he tries to figure out a way to get within striking distance. Wait, I have a levitation quirk. I can help you get closer. She offers her help, and Izuku feels a bit more fondly towards her. She was injured and trapped, but still willing to try and help someone else. That was what a hero should be. He nods his thanks, and feels a lightness in his body, as he pushes off the ground, and finds himself floating upwards like a helium balloon until the massive block of metal that was the villain's head is within range. He sinks everything he's got into the joint of the neck, the white-hot concentrated fire slicing through the cables that kept it attached until the weight of its own head dragged it off its shoulders. A final blast of flames knocks them back so they're not at risk of falling forwards towards them, and, as lightly as he was lifted, Izuku finds himself floating back down. He gracefully touches back down next to the girl. Are you okay? Is the first thing he asks when he lands. Just bruised, she nods, but is looking a bit queasy. He guesses carrying a person isn't easy. Your quirk is amazing, he says with eyes sparkling, as he grabs her hands on instinct. Thanks. She really is cute, and a bit shy too. There's still a minute left in the exam. If you hurry you might be able to get some more points, he tells her. Right. She nods with determination, and Izuku realizes he's probably being creepy, and lets go of her hands, making sure to move off in a different direction to her and the crowd. But there is only so fast he can run, and the fallen body has littered the area with rubble. With the ground so broken up, his fire barrier technique is useless. He only just manages to track down another one-pointer before President Mike's booming voice announces the end of the test. Izuku slumps against the side of a building, and pants for breath. It was a good thing Head put time into those sprinting lessons. He doesn't think Head ever run that hard out in his life. 48 points. They hadn't told them how many of the robot villains there were or how many you had to defeat to get a passing mark. He had wanted to get at least 50 points, he just had to hope he had made the cut. Maybe if he hadn't tried to save that girl he would have made that total. But how could he call himself a hero if he had left behind someone who needed help? He already knew the weight was going to kill him. Unknown to him, in a room lined with monitors, heroes were deliberating. 2 separate point totals running across the screen, as each applicant was judged on more than the amount of enemies they dispatched. For the first time in Yui's history, the 2 highest totals were exactly the same, but distributed differently. One was a 48 in villain points, with the points for a memorable rescue raising the total to 78. The second had only 30 villain points, but had gotten most of them performing rescues for a cumulative score, as the judges found themselves cheering more and more for them. It's rare enough to see 2 contestants taking on the giant robot during the exams, the principal. But they're both looking like spectacular hero candidates, don't you think, All Might? The symbol of peace looks at both screens. On one, Izuku is holding the hand of the girl he had rescued, checking to see if she was okay. On the other hand, Katsuki is standing over the fallen body of the 0-point villain. Impossible to defeat? Katsuki is yelling in the replay. A hero isn't someone who runs away from impossible odds. A hero is someone who goes beyond. Now let's get back in there, and plus ultra those bastards. Indeed, they are both looking like interesting candidates, All Might muses. It looks like he was right to look for his successor here. He waited nervously for his results every morning. Kurogiri had told him to be patient and stop fidgeting. Sensei had told him that overthinking things was part of the analysis ability of the All-for-One, but knowing that didn't help. Tamura had told him to stop talking about it and come play Mario Kart with him. Admittedly, playing Mario Kart had helped because Tamura liked Rainbow Road, and he couldn't afford to worry about anything else, but it hadn't helped for long. He had sent a message to Katsuki wishing him good luck, and hadn't had a reply. Kaken was probably off doing his own thing, and he didn't want to disturb him with his worries. He couldn't help but dwell on all the things he could have done better. From going back over his test scores in his mind, he knew he had at least passed the written exam, and that was if most of his answers had been useless. But he had no idea how the physical exam was graded or what the cutoff point was. What if he failed by a single point? What if Kaken got in, and he didn't? His mother would be so disappointed. His teacher would be so disappointed in him. How could he tell all for one all his training had gone to waste? His teacher had done so much for him. He had been the one who told him to go to Yui. He had been the one training him for the exams. If he failed, then it would disrupt the league's plans. What use was he to the league if he couldn't follow through on his part of the plan? Even with this much help, he had a duty. He was going to pay back his sensei for everything the league had done. If he couldn't do that much, then what good was his power? When the envelope had finally arrived, Head felt the weight of not knowing lifting from his shoulders. The die had been cast, and now he could finally see what fate had in store for him. Head watched the announcement with his mother, and, even though it was a habit he wanted to stop, when All Might said he not just passed, but passed with the highest marks, he had started to cry until the holographic projection had blurred in his vision into blobs of overlapping color, and he could barely hear the rest of the message over his sobbing. If he had told his younger self this was where he would be standing in the future, he doubts the younger Izuku would believe him. But he had, and he was. He had been accepted to Yui High School. Not soon afterwards he was summoned by the League of Villains. When he arrived, the atmosphere was solemn. Even though the bar was still cheerfully lit, there was a feeling of gloom in the air. Every now and then there were moments like this that reminded Izuku the League were not his friends. Tamura, who he played games with, could still kill him any time. Kurojiiri, who helped him with his maths homework, would eviscerate him if he was no longer useful to the organization, and Sensei had told him if Tamura did try and kill him, he wouldn't interfere. The League of Villains were villains after all. They weren't people you could trust. They wouldn't forgive his mistakes just because he was still a child. If he gave them a reason, they would kill him. Sensei had been there, on the screen, as Izuku stepped inside, and told him of the results. He had waited with his hands tightly clasped, hoping he had performed, as expected. Then Sensei had told him it was time for his other exam. All Might had become a teacher at Yui, something Izuku had only just found out about, but Tamura and Sensei had known about for a long time. Tamura had made a plan to kill All Might. They needed to know if Izuku could be trusted to perform his part in it. The first thing that came to mind was a yes. He had given up on living a normal life, and trying to become a hero in the normal way 7 years ago. He had spent half his life with the League, being taught by Sensei. If there was something All for One wanted him to do, he wanted to help. He wanted to be useful. He wanted to be acknowledged. Izuku could admit to himself he had become somewhat addicted to Sensei's praise. After spending so long ignoring to be told that he was important, it was something he wanted to hear over and over. He was scared of disappointing his Sensei. If the only one who had said he had potential gave up on him, he feels like he might fade away. But they weren't calling him here to test his will. The fact that he still came to them after 7 years was proof enough of that. He hadn't missed a single one of Sensei's lessons, even when his teacher forcibly tested the breaking points of his quirks, and he had felt like he was going to die. Like the Yui exam, this was going to be a test of ability. At the same time, he felt caught off guard, completely unprepared for this compared to the Yui entrance exams. But really, hadn't his time here been training in a way? How to break handcuffs, how to break a chokehold, how to break a nose. He hadn't learned those skills for the hero exam, had he? Deep down he had known this moment was coming, didn't he? He had passed the hero exam. Now it was time for the villain exam. Izuku didn't need to be told that if he failed he would die. That was the world they lived in. When villains fought, it was often to the death. If he was going to prove himself to the League, he was going to have to show he could fight like that too. Ruthlessness wasn't something that could be learned. It was something he either had or didn't, and now he was going to find out which one it was. If the League needed his help in the attack on Yui, could he kill his classmates? This test feels a lot worse than the Yui exams. If he failed here, could he say his life was ever worth anything? Would the League just dispose of his body like so much trash? Would they even leave something for the police to find, or would there be missing person posters for years afterwards? He wished he had said goodbye to his mother before he had left, hugged her one last time, told her he loved her or something. Part of him wants to run. He wishes he could flash step home, and hold his mother close, and have none of this be happening. But he shoves that part of him down. It was a cowardly, terrified reflex, and couldn't be trusted. If he runs back home, she would die too. Izuku tries to steady his breathing, as he is led downstairs into the basement. He had thrown his lot in with the League a long time ago. He had stolen money. He had stolen quirks. He should be able to do this. He was a villain. He was a villain, right? Go to the basement, All for One had said, and kill the hero there before they kill you. Sweat runs down his neck, and he balls his hands into fists to prevent them from shaking. Sensei had taught him a lot. Sensei had told him he couldn't be afraid to kill his enemies if he was going to be the successor of the All-for-One. He had said how he must be absolute, swift, and sure when striking down his enemies, as an example to all who would oppose him. Izuku stepped inside the room, and the door was shut behind him. The basement was the opposite of the cozy and welcoming atmosphere of the bar. This was not a place that was meant to be lived in. The walls were concrete. There were no windows or light source apart from a single bulb, and the only decorations were the shelves and the chains. Moving from the brightly lit bar to the dark basement has left his eyes struggling to adjust. The single light bulb isn't lit, and in the moment it takes for him to recognize the form of a hero in a dark costume, chained to the wall by his neck. The hero has seen him spotlighted against the door. There is a snapping sound like a breaking tree branch, and something wraps around Izuku's leg, and drags him across the floor until he is nearly face to face with the hero. He sees their terrified wide eyes white against the wood of their mask, legs torn off at the knee with twisting tree branches crudely trying to take their place. Kamui Woods. Quirk, lumber. Sensei must have selected him for how easy it would be to fight him with his flame quirks. This was going to be terrible. He can't do this. The realization is a sudden sinking feeling in his stomach, and he feels like throwing up, but his throat is dry. He hates though. He knows he has to. If he doesn't kill Kamui Woods, the League would do it anyway, and probably kill him for failing. He tells himself over and over to try and justify it to himself, but his trembling body still won't move. This was different to when he had fought the sludge villain a few months ago, or when he had fought Kaken all those years ago. He didn't have any hate for this person in front of him. He had no reason of his own to try and kill him. He was going to die because he was too soft-hearted. When he had thought that all the fight went out of him, he stops trembling and slowly steadies his breathing. There is a strange lightness to acceptance, like the moment between jumping off the edge and hitting the ground where your brain was still catching up to events. There had to be a peaceful way out if they could just talk about it. There had to be a way to save at least one of them. Izuku opens his mouth to say something to the hero. "They're going to kill you," he says in a small voice to the hero. "I know things look bad now, but trust me, I'm tougher than I look. We're going to make it out of this just fine," the hero says to reassure him. "No, we won't," Izuku says, and tells him briefly what he is up against. There are a few moments of stunned silence. "How do you know that?" the chained hero asks him. "Because they sent me to kill you," he says, and the words seem tiny and pathetic in the darkness. "You, yeah." Tears are running down Izuku's cheeks. "Me," the hero sighs, looking down. "I'm sorry," he says softly. "Sorry?" Izuku asks. "For this." The branches crawl like snakes across the floor, trying to bind his arms to his sides. "It's a shame to see one turn to villainy so young," the wood-controlling hero says, as he grows a branch inside the links of chains to separate them. "I'm trying to help you," Izuku yells. A branch lashes around Izuku's throat. He grabs at it, putting both his hands on the branch coiling around his neck, and reaching out. There is nothing. The wood isn't enough of a part of the hero's body for him to be able to steal the quirk through it. The branch starts to contract, and Izuku can feel it squeeze his throat. He tries to say something in protest, and just ends up weakly gasping for air. Panic sets in, and he starts to thrash futilely against the growing branches. As his vision starts to fade at the edges, the quirks he has stolen slip from his grasp, as in his panic he forgets how to use them. More branches from the lacquered chain prison wrap around his arms and legs to completely prevent him from moving, trying to cocoon him in wood. The branch around his neck grows further to wrap around his mouth, as well, and prevent him from crying out. He bites it. It makes as much of an impression as biting a table leg would. He tries to scream, and the branch in his mouth muffles the sound. Another branch grows over his eyes, and he loses what control he had. On terrified muscle memory, his body reaches for Kachan's quirk. Across the city, Katsuki Bakugo finds his power faltering, and feels the sudden stab of guilt and powerlessness at the sudden loss of his quirk. He stares at his palms, wondering what he had done to make Izuku take away his quirk again. The explosions blast a hole in the wood, scattering splinters everywhere, and Izuku cries out in terrified primal fear, and reaches for the flames. The fire responds easily to his fear, forming the shape he wants it to, as he pushes a wall of it at the branches. They catch, as easily as any normal would, as Izuku's fear builds them up into a white-hot blaze. Smoke starts to fill the air, and blind him further. He detonates more explosions, as he tries to fight free of the branches constricting his body. The burning wood lashes tighter around him, and he feels the heat of it in the burn scars that run up his arms. More burning branches strike at him like snakes through the blaze. He screams, and detonates the largest explosion he can in the direction of the growing branches, growing the flames to white-hot heat with his flame control in an effort to push back everything that is trying to ensnare him. The explosion flares white in his vision, as the explosion hits the cleaning supplies, blinding him for a few moments, as nearly the entire room becomes outlined in his fire sight. A cloud of toxic-smelling black smoke fills the room, and Izuku chokes on the terrible-smelling cloud, as it sears his sinuses. The flames he had control of snuff out against the concrete walls, leaving the flames burning around him bright in his fire sight. The clouds of smoke obscure his sight, blinding him to anything other than light and shadow. His head spins, something heavy falls on him, and the thick terrible intermingled scent of burned hair, flesh, and wood overwhelms him, as he comes face to face with the charcoal black burned face of the former hero. The explosion has left the charred wood of the mask burned into the skin, leaving the charred flesh near indistinguishable from the burnt black wood, the gleam of teeth terrible against the burnt black and red of the scorched flesh, and wide white eyes staring directly into his own. Izuku can see the plea for help from them. Half-skeletal fingers claw at him, as a rattling gasp for air rises from the hero's ruined throat, ending with a gurgle of fluid that gushes over their teeth. The burnt body twitches and collapses, as Kamui Wood stops breathing. Izuku manages to gasp in the air to scream, but vomit rises in him instead, and he throws up over the floor, the stink of burned hero's corpse rising in his nose and clinging to his skin. He claws for the door, trying to run away from the slumped body. The smoke makes his head spin, his limbs feeling weak, as he claws at the door trying to get it to open. He can't find the handle through the smoke, and he can barely breathe. Tears and snot run down his face, as he struggles for air, desperate fingers struggling to find the handle, but just dragging uselessly down the door. Oh God, oh God, oh God, he's going to die. The thought repeats over and over. He can't tell if he is only thinking it or saying it out loud with the toxic smoke making his head spin. He struggles to get upright, as he starts to cough, and spits up a large blob of black mottled mucus, and stands on shaking legs, as he manages to step. Izuku collapses on the floor of the bar, blood-streaked mucus running from his nose, as he falls to his hands, knees, and vomits. Drawing breath hurts his torn and bloody throat, but he can't stop his body from bringing up more and more of his stomach until it's just a bitter bile splattering the floor. Tears stream uncontrollably down his face, as the stink of the burnt body clings to him. In time he can breathe without vomiting, and his heartbeat slowly returns to normal. He draws in slow breaths, his throat and lungs feeling a burning pain from inhaling the toxic smoke, and he tries to focus on breathing calmly, but he can't blink without seeing the burnt face of Kamui Wood superimposed on his eyelids. By the time he is aware of anything else, Kurojiri has already cleaned up the basement and bought him a new set of clothes. He gets changed numbly, the stink of the blackened corpse seemingly ground into his soul because he cannot scrub it out of his skin. Even after he has had a thorough wash and been healed, the foul reek of the charred body lingers. All for One puts a hand on his shoulder and says he is proud of him. Katsuki couldn't see Izuku until their first day at Yui High School. As soon as he had felt his quirk disappear, he grabbed his bike and pedaled as fast as he could to the Midoriya household. He tried to keep his voice level and not glare, but tiny firecracker pops burst from his palms, as they always did when he was nervous, and wanted to check if his quirk was still his. He couldn't call forth the explosions no matter how hard he tried, and he didn't stop trying until he had knocked on the door. For him, the only thing worse than the feeling of powerlessness that came from having his quirk stolen was not knowing why or what he could do to get it back. "Can I talk to Izuku?" was the first thing he asked in a rush that squished all his words together. Izuku's mother told him that Izuku wasn't feeling well and didn't want to see anyone. Katsuki had bitten his tongue to prevent himself from swearing, and politely said he hoped Izuku was feeling better for school tomorrow, and left. He didn't go back home. If he went back home, he would end up tearing the place apart with his bare hands out of frustration. Instead, he went to the gym. There was no trouble, even though it was getting dark when he arrived. People didn't want to mess with someone like him. He looked itching to hit something, and any delinquent that liked the look of his bike could tell if they tried something it'd be them he was hitting. His coach trusted him enough to give him the spare key to the training room so he could work out during his spare time. He flicked on the lights, wheeled his bike inside, and pulled out one of the punching bags. It would be better if he had the coach there to spar with, but this was good enough. He puts on his gloves, and tightens each hand into a fist. Taking up the proper stance, he breathes out, and starts to pummel the defenseless vinyl sack. The heavy bag was for power with very little give. Each time he hit it there was a satisfying smack, as he worked out his frustrations. Slowly, but surely his punches got stronger and stronger, as he worked out his feelings. There were enough people with strength-enhancing quirks out there that places like this didn't have the customers they used to. There were less kids into martial arts programs. Smack! He hits the punching bag with a solid blow. His coach had been overjoyed when he'd come in 7 years ago, and said he wanted to be stronger. Katsuki couldn't tell him the real reason why. Katsuki grunts, as he puts his back into another solid hit. He hated being weak. He hated the fact that his strength was a privilege to be granted to him, and taken away on a whim. Izuku couldn't even give him a fucking reason. He hits the bag with a furious force. He couldn't even make the time to tell him why like, he was some fucking dumb animal to be kept on a chain. Katsuki hated feeling weak. That's why whenever he felt helpless he came here, and trained until every part of him ached. It was for a strength that couldn't be taken away from him. He would earn the power to never let anyone make him feel helpless again. He hits hard enough to cause the bag to rock, feeling the pain of the blow even through his gloves. His teeth clenched tight in a snarl, the gap in it the sign of the last time he had been made helpless. He was no one's pet. He would be a hero, without his quirk if he had to, just to prove he could do it without anyone's help or approval. He thinks of the giant robot he had punched in the entrance exam. He hadn't punched it because he had thought he'd be graded on helping everyone. He'd destroyed it because the examiner had said it wasn't something they could realistically defeat. Like a hero would ever be dissuaded just because someone said it was impossible. Whenever he got told he couldn't do something, he always wanted to prove he was stronger than they thought. A hero was someone who never lost, no matter what, and he was going to be the greatest hero. Katsuki trained until sweat dripped down his body, and his hands started to go numb from hitting the punching bag. Then his mother calls, and yells at him for leaving without telling anyone, and he cleans up, and goes home. Tomorrow is his first day of high school. Izuku will give him his quirk back then for sure. Katsuki does not sleep easily, which means he is feeling particularly pissed off in the morning, as he gets ready for school. The building is nice, but he doesn't waste any time being out at the campus or paying any attention to other students, as he tries to track down Izuku before class starts. The little nerd is being stealthier than usual. Funny, he would think Izuku would be out trying to get to know his classmates, but he's by himself when Katsuki finally tracks him down by the lockers. Keikaken, he stammers, and nearly drops the books he is holding. Damn, he looks terrible. His skin is all pale, and he has rings under his eyes. It looks like he's had a worse night than Katsuki did. He hasn't seen the nerd shiver like this since they were kids. Was someone bullying him? Katsuki dismisses the thought out of hand. How could you bully someone who could steal quirks? You're doing okay. Suckin'? He asks, and Izuku actually flinches before smiling like nothing's wrong. It's fine. He laughs artificially, and Katsuki can see the tremble in his shoulders. Just didn't sleep well. Being lied to pissed him off. It wasn't even a good lie. Izuku had to know he didn't believe it for a second. He can't just leave it when Izuku is so worried about something. I went to see you. What happened yesterday? He moves closer to Izuku, and Izuku moves back. His back hits the wall, and he flinches. I can't tell you. Izuku stammers, trying to avoid meeting his gaze. Katsuki starts feeling pissed off. And my quirk? He growls, wondering what could possibly be so important. Izuku took his quirk without telling him why. I can't tell you about that either, Kaken. Izuku looks close to crying, but Katsuki just wants an answer from him. Tell me, Katsuki demands, and as Izuku tries to escape he grabs him by the hand, and drags him around to face him, pinning him against the wall. He doesn't know what Izuku saw in his face, but he went even paler, and shoves Katsuki hard in the chest. Get away from me! He screams, and an explosion breaks them apart. His own quirk wasn't something that could harm him at such a low level, but Katsuki is still stunned. Izuku hadn't used his quirk against him since they were kids. Izuku really is crying now, as he draws his still smoking hand to his chest. I need it more now, he sobs. You understand, right? Izuku turns to try, and runs away, and Katsuki grabs his hand. Katsuki doesn't understand. Izuku isn't letting him understand. He growls, and realizes too late what he's done when the pain on Izuku's face turns to anger. Never call me that! Izuku screams, and Katsuki lets go immediately, already backing off. You never call me that name! An explosion bursts from each palm, turning into a sphere of flames. The flames grow violently to spread around Izuku's entire body. Izuku, I'm sorry. Katsuki tries to say, his voice becoming quieter, as he backs away, but the flames only continue to grow. Flames creep along the floor towards him like the grasping claws of a wild animal. Don't touch me! Don't talk to me! Don't even come near me! Izuku screams, as the flames grow further, spreading across the floor closer and closer to Katsuki. For a moment Katsuki is genuinely afraid that Izuku is going to set the fire on him, but he doesn't get a chance to find out. With a high-pitched screech the fire alarm goes off, and the sprinkler system dumps a lot of water over both of them. Izuku's flames sizzle then go out, and before Katsuki can say a word Izuku turns, and tries to run. He bumps into someone coming the other way, and slips over in the puddle. The gray scarf around the hero's neck unwinds, and lashes at the both of them with lightning speed. Katsuki finds his arms being bound to his sides. He tries to struggle, but the cloth only tightens. Katsuki manages to say one very bad word before the cloth tightens over his mouth. Detention before class has even started. The hero sighs. What a pain. Katsuki's pretty pissed off about being dragged around like this. He takes great pleasure in cussing out the teacher even though it's muffled by the cloth. The scarf feels like some sort of metal. He probably couldn't break it even with his quirk. He had his legs left free to walk and, as tempting as it was to try, and kick the teacher in the shins, it had been made very clear that if he tried it he'd be dragged the rest of the way like Izuku. He had fought way harder than Katsuki had at first until he had to be completely cocooned to drag him along. But now he had his eyes closed tight, and had stopped moving entirely. Katsuki was worried about him more than he was worried about this forced march to the principal's office. Izuku was a cocky little fucker. What could have got him so wound up he'd jump at his own shadow? And why couldn't he fucking tell him about it? He thought they were friends, or rather, Izuku thought they were friends. After their fight had started following Katsuki around. At first had tried to ignore it, and continue on with his life. But if Izuku found out he'd been teasing some other kid he'd take away Katsuki's quirk until he apologized. Then he'd take away Katsuki's quirk for anything he deemed unheroic behavior. Before long it had become safer just to stick by him, but Izuku had never taken away his quirk without giving a reason before. It had always been to punish him, or teach him a lesson. He thought that Izuku trusted him that much. YA 33TT. The cry trails behind the man himself, as All Might skids to a stop in front of the teacher. "I'll take over from here," he says with a smile, and a thumbs up. "I still have to do these students' hero interviews." The teacher has a clear look of "Are you fucking kidding me?" Is matching what Katsuki feels, but he lets them go. "Fine, but you're taking them to the principal afterwards," he tells the looming large figure of the other hero. "If they're going to act like this on the first day they shouldn't bother showing up to my class." With a lazy half-wave the teacher turns to leave. Katsuki discreetly makes a rude gesture at his back. A hand that could crush a car lands on his shoulder, as All Might leans in. "Have you boys been fighting?" The famous number 1 hero bends down to be closer to eye level with them. Katsuki finds himself trying to avoid his gaze, and sees Izuku shivering, as he gets up. His hand goes to his neck, and he shudders. Katsuki sighs. In this situation he can't really lie, and pretend that it was nothing. He's a lot more worried about whatever happened to Izuku than getting into trouble. "It was my fault," he says quietly. "Something's troubling my friend. I don't know what. I tried to find out, and pushed too hard. It ended up scaring him. Nothing would have happened. It was just an argument. No conflict where quirks are used is just an argument," the pro-hero says sternly. "Don't think you've gotten out of this. There's still going to be consequences for your actions." Those ominous words sound out of place from the guy who just sprinted down the corridor like a freaking cartoon. Katsuki watches him turn to Izuku, and offers some quiet words of comfort. Izuku is still pale, and shivering. He looks like he's seen a ghost or something worse. He keeps on running his fingers over his body, as if checking he wasn't still tied up. He had freaked out when Katsuki touched him, and now he looked worse. He couldn't even respond out loud to the questions All Might was asking him. The hero sent him to go get changed into a dry uniform, and head to class, but reached out to stop him when Katsuki tried to slip away too. "Right, like it would be that easy. Bakugo, my boy, if I can take a moment of your time. I already know I fucked up, so just skip the lecture, and give me my punishment." Katsuki shoves his hands in his pockets. "No, it's not that." All Might laughs. "As part of my role, as a teacher I'm interviewing all my students." The bulky hero opens the door to his office, and Katsuki sighs internally, and walks inside. He hated talking about this kind of shit with people. It felt like telling them how to hurt him, but he kinda owed All Might, so had let him get away with it. Just this once. He wasn't going to get in the habit of doing it. He stepped inside the small office, and sat on one of the small chairs, tilting it back, as he leaned on it. His wet uniform was going to seep through onto it, he was sure. All Might closes the door behind him, and sits behind the desk. The chair creaks when he sits on it, and the entire setup seems hilariously undersized for him. The number 1 hero carefully wheels the chair forwards, and Katsuki isn't sure whether to laugh or be pissed off. He's wasting time. All Might picks up a pad, and a pencil. "So Bakugo, my boy, tell me, what does being a hero mean to you?" "It's cool," Bakugo says dismissively, and waits for the next question. All Might gives him a look. "Is that your complete and final answer?" All Might asks, and with another internal sigh Katsuki realizes he probably owes All Might a bit more than that. "I want to be strong like you," he says, and his hands curl into fists. "I want to be a hero everyone looks up to, and acknowledges." My quirk doesn't always work, but a hero isn't someone who lets something like that stop them. He pauses for a bit to steel himself. Before you saved me from that sludge villain, I felt helpless. My quirk couldn't do anything. I had to be saved by someone else, and I don't want that to happen again. Even without my quirk, I want it so no one ever makes me feel helpless. The people, the things I hate most are the ones that say they're going to make you powerless, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's why I punched that robot in the entrance exam. I'm sick of people just accepting that there's nothing you can do. That's bullshit. A hero should be someone that never gives up, and always wins, to show that it's always possible, that you don't gotta just accept it. That there's a way you can win, even if you're so scared you feel like you're gonna die, you do it anyway to show it can be done. Katsuki shrugs. A hero should be someone that makes people feel they can be powerful. At least that's the type of hero I want to be. Very touching, Bakugo, my boy. The hero puts a hand on his shoulder. Do you know why I took up a teaching post here? Katsuki shrugs in the classic don't know, don't care kind of way. I will be retiring soon. I decided to come to the UA to choose a successor to train, as a hero. My boy, it is not an easy path, but you have the determination of a hero, and the body to match. I am asking you now, will you accept my power, and the burden of becoming the new symbol of peace? The hero shrugs, and goes to stand up. Of course you will need time to think over this offer. Yes, Katsuki says at the same time. Are you sure you understand the seriousness of what I've said to you? The symbol of peace asks him. You're saying there's a way I can be a better hero. No way in chickening out on that, Katsuki says with determination. No matter what. All Might explodes in a cloud of smoke. What the fuck? Katsuki scrambles back on the chair, as the emaciated figure sitting in the office chair coughs, and a trickle of blood runs from their mouth. They wipe it away with the back of their hand, leaving a rust-red smear. Don't yell. The withered skeleton man tells him in a quiet voice. I'll explain everything. But first eat this hair. Izuku had hoped he was over this enough to attend school, but obviously that wasn't the case. He couldn't help rubbing his fingers over where the metallic cloth had bound him, feeling a phantom pressure that wouldn't go away where the branches had grabbed him. Even after changing his uniform, he could feel the ghostly hand of the hero on his skin. He could finally blink without seeing that face, but he couldn't keep his eyes closed for longer than a minute before it reappeared. He saw it everywhere. One moment everything would be fine, and then, like a shape appearing in a cloud, he would see the burnt face of the hero again. If someone touched him, there was a moment where his memory put the face of Kamui Woods in their place, and the smell of scorched wood and skin filled his nose. It was those eyes, those desperate pleading eyes that stared into his soul. He kept seeing them. His sensei said the first time was always the hardest. His sensei had known he had it in him to be the ruthless killer he needed to be. That was why he had forced the activation of the hero's quirk. Sensei had said that in time he wouldn't even notice when he was killed. He was a murderer now. That was something he could never change, and something those accusing dead eyes would never let him forget. The school he had looked forward to attending seemed to have the color leached from it. Everything has faded. He walks back to the teacher's office, still touching his neck, as if the feeling was something he could pull off his skin. He should apologize to Kaken, but he was gone by the time made his way back to the teacher's office. He hadn't meant to lash out at him like that. He hadn't even meant to take his quirk, it had just been the first one he had reached for in his panic. Now he was afraid to let it go in case something else happened, and he needed to defend himself. The ghost of Kamui Woods was following him, and it was messing with his head. He struggled to organize his thoughts as he walked. He couldn't shake the sensation that he was being watched. It was still his first day, so he had to avoid getting into any more trouble. Already cringing, he knocked on the door. You wanted to see me? His voice is a timid squeak. Come in, my boy, and take a seat. All Might pats the seat in front of him. Izuku feels like he is going to die. Surely somehow the branches had left a mark, writing his sins on his skin for anyone to read. Izuku feels like he is going to die. All for One had told him to try and avoid drawing All Might's attention to himself, that the symbol of peace wouldn't show mercy for his age if he found out Izuku shared the quirk of his hated enemy. He would deserve it. The guilt twists his stomach. All Might's hand lands heavy on his shoulder. Young Midoriya, can you tell me what's troubling you? Izuku breaks down. The tightly wound string of anxiety that had been propelling him forward snaps, and opens the floodgates. He couldn't do this, he just couldn't do this. His attempts to draw breaths are pathetic hiccups, as the tears stream uncontrollably down his cheeks. He had promised he wouldn't be someone who cried all the time, and that promise had been broken. He wasn't the kind of person Sensei wanted him to be, and he never would be. Something touches his shoulders, something warm and strong, and he looks up into the smiling face of the #1 pro hero. Izuku sobs against the hero's chest, as arms that could crush a tank encircle him. I was attacked. Izuku manages to gasp out between sobs. He clings to the hero's shirt. I used my quirk to hurt someone. I didn't want to, but I was so scared. He whimpers. It's going to be alright. Why? Because I am here. All Might smiles. Izuku takes a shameful comfort from those words, as the flow of tears starts to slow. All Might pats him on the back. Midoriya, my boy, you're not alone here. You have all the other teachers to help you, and protect you. All you have to do is ask, he says to comfort the sobbing child. All Might stabs at his chest with one thumb. I, All Might, will personally make sure no harm comes to you within this school. The number one hero laughs. Izuku wipes away his tears with the back of his hand, but the corners of his mouth are curling upwards. There's that hero's smile. All Might claps him on the shoulder, and nearly knocks him out of the chair. Be brave, my boy, and if you find yourself feeling lost or afraid, your friends are always there to help. Right. Izuku nods with determination. Go out there, and do your best, as a promising young hero. Plus ultra. All Might stands on the desk for dramatic effect. Right. Izuku wipes away the last of his tears. Now then, young man, you have a hero class to attend. All Might points towards the door. Right. Izuku pulls his still damp school bag up around his shoulders. Thank you for your help. He bows. It is no problem. Please, feel free to see me if you need anything else. All Might declares, covering his mouth with one hand. Izuku heads off, leaving All Might to wipe away the dribble of blood that had run down the corner of his mouth. The number one hero flops back in his chair, and covers his face with an emaciated hand. That boy, Midoriya, was a good kid, but he was so jumpy because he got attacked? First All for One had shown up within 10 meters of him, and now students were getting attacked. All Might prayed he could make good on his promise, and went to go see the principal. As he walked, Izuku struggled to keep hold of his confidence. He felt a stab of guilt from the fact that talking with All Might actually made him feel better. He knew that the symbol of peace was his sensei's most hated enemy, and that under his bluster was a dying old man. But he could use some false bravado right now, just enough to stop him jumping at shadows. He works on keeping his breathing steady, trying to act like he belongs there, as he looks for the classroom. He was already late. His homeroom teacher was going to be so upset, and he was going to miss learning so much. He had wanted to spend some time getting to know his classmates, but now he'd be lucky to learn their names. He keeps his focus on school-related things to distract himself from seeing Kamui again. Get to class, make some friends, apologize to Kaken. He repeats it over to himself to prevent himself from getting distracted. Walking alone in these corridors makes the feeling of being watched grow until he is almost running in his search for the classroom. When he finally spots the door, he feels a burst of relief. As he rushes towards it, takes a moment to steel himself, and opens the door. Every eye is immediately on him. The stares penetrate like arrows. The tall blonde hero writing on the board turns to look at him, and his gaze is the worst. He feels like he's just walked in naked. Aye, he stammers, unable to find his words. His gaze falls on the whiteboard, and what is written at the top of it? Class 1B Homeroom Teacher Blood King. I have the wrong room. He manages to say, his cheeks already turning bright red. Sorry for disturbing you. He hears the laughter start behind him, as he backs away, and closes the door. His cheeks burning from embarrassment, he breaks into a run, and tries to hold back the tears. How did he manage to walk into the wrong class in a school with only 2 classrooms? He was never going to be able to live this down. He almost sprints across the school to find Class 1A before the bell rings. He just prays the teacher will be forgiving of his absence. When he finally finds the right door, checking 5 times to make sure that's where he's supposed to be, he tries to drive the blush of embarrassment from his cheeks, and opens the door. The classroom is empty. Izuku tries to stop tears building in his eyes. What should he do now? His frozen indecision doesn't last long before someone comes up behind him, and walks into the room. His fears lessen, but don't fade, as everyone slowly returns, and takes their seats. He waits in the corner of the room, staring at his feet, and trying not to panic, as people filter in. He just wants to be unnoticed, and continue the school day like a normal student, but the universe has other ideas. As much as he tries not to be noticed, someone strides up to him, and demands to be acknowledged. What do you think you're doing causing such trouble on the first day of school? The taller boy demands, and Izuku flinches. Have you no respect for this institution? If you aren't going to take your studies here seriously, you might as well be expelled. Your actions here are an inexcusable mark on the reputation of this class. Tears are brimming in Izuku's eyes. I'm sorry. He whimpers. You should be. The other student doesn't let up, even though Izuku is a hair away from slumping to the ground, and crying. I was informed you would be disciplined by the proper authorities, but such a lapse in judgment, as to pick a fight on the first day. Izuku can't back further into the corner without a triangular backbone, and his breathing is starting to pick up, as he is trapped further in the corner. There is nowhere he can run to. He can feel himself reaching for Kachan's quirk he keeps at his fingertips with every stabbing word. The light seems to be fading from the room, as his fear grows inside him. "Leave him alone!" Katsuki snarls, grabbing the other boy's arm, and pulling him back. There is a sliver of light in Izuku's vision. "Like you have any right to talk after that pathetic display. This course has no need for people who aren't serious about becoming a hero." The student turns around, and starts berating Katsuki. "You're really pissing me off right now." Katsuki snarls, and flexes his hands as he did when he wanted to set off an explosion while Izuku had his quirk. There is no room here for heroes that can't use their own quirks. The other student looks down on him, and Kaken actually looks ashamed. "You are lucky your friend here placed worse due to his absence, otherwise you would have been expelled." "You don't have to rub it in," Katsuki snarls. "If I'm going to get kicked out anyway, I might as well get kicked out for kicking your ass. At your current skill level?" The other student snorts, clearly unimpressed. "You're 1,000 years too early." "That's enough, Ida," a familiar voice says, and Izuku recognizes the cute girl he had met in the exam. He gets the point. Ida snorts, still glaring at them, and goes to take his seat. "Are you doing O.K? Your face is super pale," the cute girl says, and Izuku forces a smile. "I'm fine." He tries to keep his voice level. "Are you sure? Because you're really sweaty. And when Ida was talking you looked like you were going to throw up." The girl goes on to say, and offers a hand. "That's bad, huh?" Izuku says, realizing he has ended up crouching trying to defend himself. He takes the hand, and straightens up. "Sorry, I haven't introduced myself. I'm Ochako Uraraka." The cute girl smiles, and Izuku feels his heart calming. "Midoriya Izuku." Izuku introduces himself, and looks around. "And that's Kaken." Katsuki snorts, and looks away, still sulking with his arms crossed tightly. "Sorry for bothering you." He apologizes, also avoiding eye contact. Ida's a nice guy really, he's just a bit stuffy. And sure, if you get to know him you'll get along just fine." She claps her hands together with enthusiasm, then her face falls. "Well, if you get to know him. What do you mean by that?" Izuku asks with a sinking feeling. "Well, we just had a quirk aptitude test, and Kaken got last place." Uraraka starts to explain. "Don't call me that," Katsuki says sulkily. Uraraka looks confused. "Only my friends can call me that." Katsuki sulks, leaning against the wall. "Oh, do you not want to be friends with me?" Uraraka asks. "No," Katsuki snaps, and notices the sad look on her face. "It's not that look, we just met, how can we be friends? I'd like to be your friend." Uraraka smiles. "Classmates should get along, right?" "Yeah, Kaken." Izuku chips in, and Katsuki glares daggers at him. Instead of responding like Izuku hopes, Katsuki turns on his heels, and gets back into his seat. Izuku quickly follows suit, and gets back into his seat before the teacher returns, and notices him standing around. It doesn't work. The teacher that walks into the room causes a stab of instinctive fear in him, as they turn, and lock eyes with him. It's the teacher that had broken up their fight. He doesn't look impressed. Izuku shrinks back in seat, hoping that he won't say anything, and just gets on with the lesson, but his last hope is dashed. I would expel you right now, but the principal says you deserve a second chance, so you have tomorrow to convince me you deserve to stay," the teacher says in a tone that makes Izuku's spirits sink to the bottom of his stomach. "You took Bakugo. The only reason you're still here is that Midoriya failed to show up for the test. So far you are at the bottom of the class. Don't think you can coast on your entrance exam score or you will be going home." Izuku shrinks back into his seat. "Now the two worst students in this class understand they'll be putting on a demonstration tomorrow. We can move on." The teacher turns back to the whiteboard. Izuku is glad the rest of the day is normal. He doesn't think his heart could take much more. It was a relief to go over the curriculum sheet of largely normal classes, and remind himself there were things he could still do. English problems were far less intimidating than hero work, even with a teacher as eccentric as President Mike, and little by little he manages to calm himself. He feels like he had failed some secret test of all for once. A real villain wouldn't feel as guilty as he did over Kamui Wood's murder. They wouldn't be jumping at their own shadow in such a way they made it obvious to everyone. A hero was someone who kept their head in a crisis, and a villain had to keep their head too. He had failed on both accounts. No wonder the teacher had put him at the bottom of the class. He had a lot of work to do if he wanted to spend another day in this hero's school. It was time for him to act instead of just react. If he worked hard, and said the right thing, he might still be able to salvage the situation. If he ran crying trying to find peace, he would go back to being the pathetic, useless kid he was when Kurojairi had first found him. It was one of Sensei's first lessons. Helping someone makes them beholden to you. Before you rely on others, rely on yourself, and your own strength. He could do this. He lies to himself to psyche himself up. he could do this. This felt like the real test of his resolve. Even if he couldn't sleep easy, he couldn't let this haunt him forever. One step at a time, he needed to keep moving forwards, or he would stop here forever. No doubt even if he confessed, he would go mad from guilt, haunted by the charred specter of the hero he had murdered. Deep breaths, he inhales, and exhales slowly to calm his still hammering heart. As much as he wants to fade into the background and disappear, he can't. Sensei had told him he had to make friends among the students, allies that could be trusted to obey his orders and aid him in his search. All Might had chosen this school for a reason. Sensei believed he was looking for an heir to train, as his successor, someone to inherit the quirk that could not be stolen, one for all. His job was to, from the inside, find out who this inheritor will be, and either turn them to the League of Villains or, if he had to, kill them. Without an inheritor, the quirk would die with its host, so if Tamura did succeed with his plan to kill All Might, one for all would be erased with the symbol of peace. Izuku didn't have the guts to tell his sensei he wasn't sure if he could do it. To kill in frenetic self-defense, and to kill in cold blood, they seemed worlds apart. But he was already a murderer, right? As soon as he had free time, the first thing he had to do was find Kaken. He deserved the truth, or at least some of the truth. As much of the truth as he dared to tell. Kaken was his friend. Izuku had to believe he would understand. This day had started badly, as it was. He couldn't take losing his best friend on top of that. He worked diligently throughout the day, not being included in the chatter of any of the other students, and not trying to assert himself into anyone's conversations. The time for befriending the rest of the class would be later. He spends his spare brain power rehearsing what he is going to say. He doesn't want to break down in front of his best friend again. As much as he doesn't want to talk about this, he has to bite the bullet if he is going to make it up to his friend. As soon as the bell rings, he is heading for Katsuki's desk. Kaken, I have something to tell you in private, he says, grabbing Katsuki's shirt sleeve, as his friend turns to leave the room. Can you meet me on the roof? Katsuki looks down at him, his school bag hanging off his shoulder by a single strap. I guess. He shrugs, and tries to look disinterested. Great, let's go. Izuku's words blend together, as he speaks quickly, pulling Katsuki along, and up the stairs. Getting to the roof is a lot simpler than getting to class. They just had to keep going up. It would be private there, or at least, as private as they could get on school grounds. You know, everyone in class is going to think this is a love confession or something, Katsuki points out, as Izuku opens the door to the roof. Izuku turns around with a bright blush of embarrassment spreading over his freckled cheeks. A love confession? That was the last thing on his mind right now. Not that he would mind if his classmates thought. But no, he hadn't meant it like that at all. Katsuki's joking smirk fades, and his face becomes hard-set with determination. So what is this really about? His tone becomes deadly serious, and Izuku can tell he can't half-ass things here, and still be Kaken's friend. About yesterday, IWWWIW was why did his nerve have to fail here? He can't keep his voice from wavering, and the tears are already pricking the corners of his eyes. The memory is just too fresh. How can he possibly explain what had happened? Someone attacked me? Izuku manages to gasp out. He feels like there is something lodged in his throat, preventing him from swallowing. His shaking knees give out underneath him, and he slumps downwards. Katsuki's face turns from confusion into rage. What? Tell me what they looked like. I'm going to kill them. Katsuki slams a fist into his palm, practically frothing at the mouth. Izuku shakes his head, not trusting himself to open his mouth without vomiting. He swallows. They grabbed me, and I couldn't use my quirk. Izuku's voice wavers. So I took yours and Kaken, I hurt them badly. Real bad. Well, they deserved it, Katsuki snorted. The tears start to flow, as Izuku struggles for breath. There was nothing I could do, he cries. I'm so scared, Kaken. What if it happens again? I can't. Izuku starts to bawl, the tears flowing hard, and fast, and mingling with the snot from his running nose. It was the first time since he got his quirk that he had felt so utterly helpless. Man, I haven't seen you looking this pathetic in ages. Katsuki sighs. This has really shaken you up, huh? Izuku can't stop the tears long enough to respond. His sobs are sharp gasps for air. Katsuki sits next to him, and puts an arm around his shoulder. As long as you get me, everything is gonna be fine. If anyone tries to hurt you, I'll stop them, he promises with a smile. Without my quirk if I have to, so stop worrying about it. Izuku sniffs. Thank you? He says in a small voice. I mean, one of us has to act like a real hero around here. Katsuki brags. Seeing as how you're the most bottom of the class, I guess you're going to need me to save you a lot. Mean Kaken? Izuku says, and wipes his tears away. If Kaken was teasing him, then he guesses he was forgiven, so put your big egghead brain to work then. We're going to need a plan to pass Sensei's test tomorrow. Katsuki grabs him by the hair, and lightly shakes his head. For a moment with a stab of panic Izuku thinks Katsuki is talking about all for one before he remembers that obviously the school has different teachers. Something to analyze, something to distract himself. So what is the teacher like? Izuku asks. What kind of exercise did he have you doing? Katsuki looks away. Quirk aptitude test. A P exam to see how well we could supplement our abilities with our quirks. He said the person who got last place would be expelled. Katsuki's grip tightens subconsciously. I wasn't doing too badly until he took away a bunch of points for being in contempt of the exercise. I got last, then he said that because you never showed up you got 0 points. I overheard the rest of the assholes in our class talking, saying he's probably going to expel which one of us places last, or both of us. Kaken Izuku's voice wavers. I'm so sorry. Shit, and you just stopped crying. Katsuki swears, angry at himself for upsetting Izuku again. Look, it's fine, yeah, I was majorly pissed off before, but now you've told me what the problem is. Just trust me. Katsuki slams a fist into his palm again, this time detonating an explosion at the point of impact. His smile is predatory. If anyone tries to hurt you again, I'll be there to beat them to death with my bare hands if I have to. He glares out at nothing, and then offers a still smoking palm. Izuku takes it, and his friend helps him up. Just try not to worry too much. You're always overthinking things. Katsuki snorts. You gotta focus on what you can do now, stiato what you should have done. Right. Izuku wipes the tears away with his already damp sleeves. Kaken forgives him, he still has a friend. Even though he knows Sensei always said that relying on others was a weakness of the soul, he was happy Kaken was still someone he could count on. If that robot bastard starts trying to chew you out again, I'm going to punch him, expulsion or no expulsion. Katsuki boasts, as they make their way back down the stairs. Robot bastard? Izuku asks, half paying attention, as he tries to formulate a plan. There wasn't much to go on. The teacher looked pretty reclusive for a hero, and Izuku didn't know what his quirk was. Of course, considering the amount of heroes with full-body costumes on top of that, there were too many variables. If he didn't know his quirk, he didn't know where to start. Yeah, he does this thing with his hands when he talks. Katsuki gestures in demonstration. Plus he talks like a robot too, no offense. He adds to the small droid emptying a trash can, who makes what is surely an obscene gesture with its forklift arms. Fucking elites learning all their heroing from textbooks. He mutters under his breath, acting like they know everything about everything. Hey, it's you! A voice calls out from behind them, and Izuku instinctively draws closer to Katsuki for protection. The one who ran into our class this morning. Enjoying your first day? You should, it's probably your last day as well. The other student draws level with him. Katsuki bares his teeth. Who the fuck are you? He growls, already squaring himself up for a fight. Monoma Nito, I'll be your new classmate in 1A soon. That is, assuming you don't get expelled too. Izuku grabs Katsuki's sleeve to stop him from throwing a punch. Is that really the way a member of the top class in the heroics department should be acting? Nito tuts, and walks past them. Well, I guess someone from Class B like me wouldn't understand that. See ya later or not. Katsuki snorts, and pulls his arm away from Izuku's grip. You should have let me deck him, he says. I wouldn't have done any good. Izuku points out. Please Kaken, I don't want us to get in any more trouble than we already are. Izuku's voice cracks, and Katsuki's expression softens. Geez, what a pain in the ass, he sighs, but sticks by Izuku's side instead of hunting Nito down. Did you really run into their classroom? Izuku nods. You dork. Katsuki quietly chastises him. Sorry Kaken. Izuku murmurs. Honestly, you should be glad I'm sticking around you. Katsuki folds his arms behind his head. Without me you'd probably get beaten up all the time. In fact, I think I deserve some gratitude. Say thank you the amazingly kind and talented Katsuki for looking after me. Like I'm going to do that Kaken. Izuku grumbles, but begins to feel a little better. Tonight he has a report to write to the league. Hopefully they aren't too disappointed in him. Tomorrow he was going to pass the test, and get to work on the most important part of his school days. He had to decide whose quirks were worth stealing. Izuku was no longer jumping at shadows by the next day. He still felt the sensation of being watched, of every shadow in the alleyway about to turn to ensnaring branches. But he walked on. Out of the corner of his eye he still saw that looming face of burnt wood, and it still startled him, but he collected himself, and walked on. Even if he was still afraid, the only thing he could do was keep moving forwards. He takes deep breaths to steel himself, and pushes on regardless. His sensei had not been pleased. Izuku should have either stood out to establish himself as a figure for others to crowd around or fade into the background to observe them without being noticed. He had done neither, and his overall first impression had been weak. It was not an all-bad situation, He had probably put himself beyond suspicion from the teachers, but he needed to work hard to show his teacher he deserved to remain a part of the organization. Izuku has no idea what kind of test Aizawa-sensei is going to give them. If it was a pen and paper exam, then he's worried Katsuki won't pass. Kaken wasn't stupid, but he didn't have much patience with exams, and if it's something like long-distance running, he doesn't have the best stamina for things like that. If it was something they could do together, then they had a chance. Katsuki was his oldest friend, and the person had spent the most time fighting alongside. They had been stupid kid fights against playground bullies and rowdy teens, but they covered each other's weaknesses well. In particular, his biggest weakness, being ambushed, wasn't something Izuku had seriously thought about before. Usually when he needed a flame, he was in an area where he could grab one, or he could use his lighter. Now he realizes that relying on a handheld lighter to make flames was a big glowing weak spot of his. All it would take was a single shot, and his flame control was worthless. If he reached for Kachan's quirk during school, he would expose himself. There had to be a way for him to prevent this. He had gotten to school early, and asked around. The Department of Heroics was the most impressive for sure, but the other departments of the school were admirable in their own way. Izuku despised the way the school pitted the classes against each other. He hadn't even been here a week, and he already had enemies, just for being accepted into the A class. Lost in thought, he nearly walked into his target. Pink hair, check. Non-regulation uniform, check. Crosshair iris markings, check. Mayhatsum, quirk zoom, a gadget. There was a strict stratification of quirks in society, enforced by the school system. Really, he shouldn't be down here, talking to those with quirks judged inferior to his, but that's what made Izuku want to. These students here, who had fought so hard only to be shoved into other sections, what was it they wanted? He told me exactly what he wanted, and she'd been happy to oblige. Then he had left to prepare for whatever demonstration his teacher wanted to give. If worse came to worst, if he did end up dropping out, he'd join the League of Villains full-time to try and regain his worth. Izuku had heard nothing from the teacher about what the demonstration was. Once everyone had entered the classroom, he and Katsuki, and only he and Katsuki, were told to put on their PE uniforms and go out into the yard. Izuku nervously checked the location of his lighters in case of emergency, as the entire class followed them out to watch. The teacher looked bored and exhausted as he found an arbitrary spot and motioned for everyone to back away. Izuku gulped, a cold sweat of nervousness running down his neck, as he and Kaken were the only two left in the growing circle. Today you'll be giving a sparring demonstration, the teacher says in a tired drone. Izuku turns and looks at Katsuki. They were going to fight each other? He doesn't want to go home now, but he doesn't want to crush his friend's dreams either. Against me, the air temperature seems to drop. If you fail to drop me, you will both be expelled. Everyone else, pay close attention. The silvery scarf unwraps from his neck, and the teacher reaches down to fit in place a pair of yellow slitted goggles. Izuku feels a jolt, as he recognizes what hero the teacher is. Eraserhead quirk, erasure, the ability to nullify a quirk. Shit. Izuku feels a sinking feeling in his stomach, as he squares up. Fighting a UA teacher, a pro hero with years of experience, would be bad enough, but this was a really bad matchup. Everything created by his flame control would disappear if his quirk got negated. The ends of the silvery scarf appear to hover, filling him with fear. To be grabbed by those, he would lose control again. He just knew it. He swallows, his breathing already getting harder. He had to avoid the scarf, and he had to avoid getting his quirk nullified. What to do? Zuken, what's the plan? Katsuki asks him, cracking his knuckles. It wasn't just him. He had fought with Katsuki before they could do this. He had to believe that. Izuku exhales, and lets his anxiety go, as he focuses on the now. His quirk is quirk erasure. If he looks at you, your quirk will stop working. With those goggles on, we can't see who he's looking at either, he tells Katsuki. Won't be a problem. Katsuki punches his palm. If you just rush and he'll tie you up with that scarf of his. We need to coordinate this. Izuku tells him. Remember what we did to that kid who was drowning kittens? The one with the duplication quirk? Oh ho, you're pissed off. Katsuki smirks. I'm not going to underestimate an opponent like this, Izuku says, and flicks out his lighter. As he spins the wheel, and it sparks, a thrown rock knocks it out of his hand. The cheap plastic container shatters on the ground, and the lighter fluid pools on the dirt. No one's going to call out "go in a real battle," the teacher says, and suddenly closes the distance. Izuku swears, and the two split off in different directions. This was the first time he had fought an opponent that could negate someone's quirk. He was lucky that the teacher didn't know the full workings of his quirk. As he flicks one of his spare lighters into his palm, and turns the wheel, the flame shines in his fire sight. So Kaken was the one that was currently quirkless. Both of them fought to maintain their distance, wary of being grabbed by the silver cloth. Katsuki constantly sets off small explosions from his palm, an audible indicator that he still has his quirk, and they pop up brightly in his fire sight. First test, wall. Izuku draws off as much flame as he can, as quickly as he can without extinguishing the lighter, trying to cut off their opponent. The wall of flame twists, extends then extinguishes, as his fire sight goes dark. Izuku swears again, as the teacher turns towards him, the cloth already extending to grab him. He can't use the all-for-one here. Izuku dodges the cloth by leaping forwards instead of away. The reaching ends of the scarf miss, and he rolls away from the coils that snap towards his legs. He throws the still flaming lighter at the teacher's face, hoping the light will break his concentration. He knocks it away with one hand without turning to look at it. "Are you sure wrapping something around your neck is such a good idea, sensei?" Katsuki calls, and reaches out to grab a part of the scarf. He tugs hard, not disturbing the teacher an inch, but pulling more of the coils closer to him. Still Izuku feels his fire sight flicker, and immediately calls up bright darts of flame to sting at the eyes of his opponent. The coils of silver cloth withdraw to shield his face from the bright glow, and Katsuki charges forwards. One brief explosion bursts from his palm before his quirk is erased. Katsuki doesn't slow down in the slightest, as he charges forwards regardless, balling one hand into a fist, as he lunges forwards. The teacher's foot catches him in the stomach, and kicks him away. Katsuki retches violently, but manages to not be sick. From the other side Izuku builds a new wall of flames, this time spreading out to shield him. As he moves so he is hidden by the glow. He sends it forwards to engulf his opponent. Katsuki smirks, as the flames close over the teacher, hiding him from view. A slash of the silvery cloth breaks a hole in the cocoon of flames, and Izuku feels his fire sight die, and with it the flame wall. Katsuki, waiting behind the flame wall, closes the remaining distance, and aims a solid blow at the teacher's unprotected back. An explosion bursts from his palm to augment the hit, but the teacher leaps out of the way, and Katsuki finds himself sprawling in the dirt instead. The teacher stands on his back. "What are you going to do now?" Eraserhead says coldly, a loop of his scarf in his hand. "You have no quirk, and nowhere to run to. People who rely only on having a flashy quirk aren't cut out to be heroes." Izuku bites his lip to keep himself from calling out, "Go home, kid. This school doesn't need heroes who are too scared to fight." Katsuki moves his hand, slamming it down on the puddle of fluid from the first lighter that the teacher is now standing by, and setting his shoe on fire. The hero quickly moves his foot, and Katsuki rolls over, and hits him hard in the crotch. It has less effect than he would like, and the silvery material of the scarf lashes around him to prevent him from scrambling away. But Izuku doesn't waste the effort. While his fire sight is still burning strong he grows the flames, as high as he can. His flames didn't need fuel to grow, or rather their fuel was something internal. From the sparks that Katsuki provided he can grow the fire, as large as he needed. Eraserhead chooses to release Katsuki to smother the fire using the silvery cloth, and Katsuki scrambles to his feet, breathing heavily. This was an intense match. One wrong move would end them. Izuku feels his fire sight die, and gives a signal to Katsuki. Katsuki throws the second lighter, the one Eraserhead had knocked away earlier, and detonates an explosion at the same time. A short rain of fire falls towards the hero, and Katsuki swings. The teacher grabs his fist, and throws him, moving so that the burning oil splatters the ground instead of him, and grinds the flames out with his boot. Izuku takes advantage of the temporary pause to create more flames. Izuku screams a wordless cry of frustration and rage, and charges forwards, charging head-on. The boy really is useless, the teacher mutters under his breath. Izuku's bones were starting to ache from the effort of using so much flame so quickly. He builds 4 flame walls, as shields, each large enough to hide a person behind, and moves them in sync to give no clue as to which one he's actually hiding behind. All for One had told him that in a situation where one was at a disadvantage first resort should be to wide scale, and through destruction of all opponents or, as Tamura had jokingly put it, there's no kill like overkill. His sensei's advice in this situation would be to fill the entire area with flame, but that wasn't what a hero would do. Time to take action. He charged in at the same time as the flame walls. If he could just get close enough, the end of the silver scarf whips through all 4 walls of fire to tighten around Izuku's waist. It pulls him through the thin layer of flame to slam into the ground at the hero's feet. For a moment Izuku's mind projects a burning tree branch in place of the silver cloth, and he screams, "Predictable." Eraserhead sighs, as he turns to stop Katsuki's charging attack with the cloth. Izuku grabs him from behind, trying to ignore the feeling of the cloth tightening around him. He half was expecting to end up clutching nothing but air, but he actually grabs the hero solidly from behind and, with tears of fear still rolling down his cheeks, throws him. There is less weight to the hero than he thought there would be, as if he hasn't been eating. Katsuki smiles, as he sees the teacher's body bend backwards, and hit the ground, and roll. The smile doesn't have time to fade before the teacher is lightly rolling back to his feet from the throw, and wrapping them both in the metal scarf. Loops of the metallic cloth tie them back to back, tying legs and arms together palm to palm so neither can use their quirk, and binding their mouths so they can't talk. Izuku stiffens with fear at the feeling of being bound completely helpless, and forces himself not to reach for a new quirk to free himself. The teacher stands up straight, and stretches. Now then, who can tell me what they learned? He asks the class while Izuku struggles not to hyperventilate. Always wear a cup. A purple-haired kid says in awe. Not what I was looking for, but yes, villains will always try to attack obvious weak points. They're the first places you should protect. Anyone else? The teacher proceeds to take class normally while Izuku looks down, and tries not to cry. They use flanking maneuvers to support each other. The student who told him off the other day says, correct. Against a villain who can only use their quirk against one other, flanking divides their attention, and reduces their effectiveness. The teacher adds, and points to the next student in line. They had hand signals. The boy with the bird's head adds, nonverbal communication prevents alerting your enemy to your plans. Next, the teacher points out, his voice already sounding bored. Oh, the guy with the fire quirk pretended like he couldn't fight up close so you'd let your guard down. A boy with spiked red hair yells out. That was super cool when he threw you. The teacher gives him a look. Katsuki wriggles against Izuku's back, trying to find a way to break out of the metal cloth. Now, what did they do wrong? Yes, you. The teacher points to a student with her hand up. They relied too heavily on each other. Midoriya was entirely reliant on the distraction of his partner to use his abilities, and he didn't try anything new until he was forced to. The long-haired girl points out. You, Bakugo, were too direct and reckless in attacking. You made good use of the flames as a distraction, but all your attacks were simple and telegraphed. It wouldn't have taken long to take you down individually. Very good. The teacher nods. In addition, you both became overconfident after the last throw. Aizawa-sensei took care to remove anything you could use to escape before tying you up. You should have realized earlier he was forcing you to use up your emergency defenses before launching a final attack. Well, that's about all I had to say. The teacher scratches and undoes Izuku's bindings. Being scared that an opponent is someone you can't beat is a luxury a hero doesn't have. You have to use your head, as well as be brave, and figure out the best course of action. A hero can't just think, well, I tried my best, he tells him. A hero gets results when no one else can. The teacher turns to Katsuki, and for God's sake try, and use your quirk for something other than punching things. There's only one hero in the world with enough brute strength to pull that off. You need to think of other ways to solve your problems if you want to make it, as a hero. Not everyone's going to stand still for a haymaker. Class dismissed. Everyone starts to shuffle away, heading back to the classroom. Izuku looks down at his feet, and tries to catch his breath. Well, get up, the teacher says in bored tones. Well, pack our things, Izuku says gloomily. About that, the teacher says with a sigh. I'm not going to be expelling you after all. He laughs in a way less than comforting. It was a logical ruse. Katsuki's face very clearly shows he thinks this is bullshit. He very specifically does not mention that he would have expelled them both yesterday if All Might hadn't interceded with the principal on their behalf. He had agreed to give them a second chance to see if Midoriya could face and overcome his trauma. And technically they had made his back touch the ground, which was impressive for first years. It was a test of your determination and teamwork, he tells them. If you had prioritized your own success or sabotaged the other, I would have expelled both of you. Seeing as you can work together, I want to make more fuss like that argument you had in the hallway, or you're both being tossed out. The hero readjusts the metallic cloth around his neck to hide his goggles. Ha! I knew we could do it. Piece of cake. Katsuki folds his hands behind his head. It's too early to be celebrating. The teacher cuts them off. You passed barely. You're still bottom of the class. Now go get changed. He walks off, leaving Izuku to wipe tears of happiness out of his eyes. The most Izuku had been hoping for today was not being expelled. Had never expected to be well known. When they returned to the class, everyone wanted to talk to them about the fight. Katsuki bathed in their attention like a cat in sunlight. But Izuku really wasn't expecting people to want to talk to him. After his disastrous first day, it was nice to know everyone didn't hate him. In fact, a few of them were impressed they had managed to last as long as they did in a fight against the teacher. That was a super manly move there. Someone slaps Katsuki on the back. Damn right it was. Katsuki snorts, and punches his palm with a small explosion. Nice dodging. A bubblegum pink-skinned girl yells from behind Izuku, and makes him jump. Thank you? Izuku stammers. I knew you could do it, Uraraka says, and claps her hands together. Well, then Izuku is a bit embarrassed by the attention. He's sure he should be acting cooler. Thank you for believing in me, he smiles. Give me a minute, I've got to go rub it into the robot bastard that we're awesome. Katsuki tells Izuku, already starting to stride forwards. Izuku catches up to him, and grabs at his sleeve. Kaken, please don't, he protests, but Katsuki's got a look in his eyes. Izuku steps in front of him. Kaken, this isn't the time to pick fights. You've proven yourself already, he says firmly. I maybe have been mistaken about you. The student Katsuki refers to, as the robot bastard replies, and pushes up his glasses. You're obviously competent at least when it comes to combat. Well, you're no basket of roses either. Katsuki snorts, and makes a threatening gesture. How rude. Sorry, he's like that. Izuku apologizes. You were right earlier. Fighting in school was poor discipline, but here there seems to be some fire in his eyes, and his voice steadies. You shouldn't underestimate me or Kaken. You'll end up regretting it. He smiles, and the other student flinches, looking confused. I haven't properly introduced myself. Izuku offers a hand. I am Midoriya Izuku. I hope we can get along. The other student adjusts his glasses. Ida Tenya, from Somei High. He takes the offered hand. Izuku spends the rest of the day making connections, learning his classmates' quirks, and shaking hands. Most people wanted to talk about their quirks if you asked. They wanted to show off the talents that made them special, and Izuku's genuine enthusiasm meant they ended up saying more than they meant to. If anyone was reluctant, Izuku would say he wanted to know how they could work together, as a team. It was an approach that worked for most, except for those the class probably thought of as the cool kids, or rather they wanted to be thought of as the cool kids, and Ida, who was planning on showing off his quirk at the appropriate time. By the time Izuku breaks for lunch, he is feeling pretty good about the day's prospects. He's doing well in class, and he knows at least everyone's name. Things seem a little brighter. He was nearly humming, as he took his lunch tray back to sit with his new friends. So you didn't drop out after all. Such a shame. A voice he recognizes says from behind him. Izuku turns, noticing the smug smiling face of Minome Nito. He feels a lot more confident now. No, I didn't, he says calmly. Well, congratulations. Nito replies without a trace of sincerity. Izuku puts his tray down, and gives the Class B student his full attention. May I talk to you for a moment? He asks. There is a flicker of disbelief in Naito's eyes. He wasn't expecting to actually be given full attention, but he recovers quickly. Oh, wanting to laud it over me that you're at the top, and am not? He teases. No. You're holding a grudge. I want to know why. Izuku bluntly states. So far I'm guessing your quirk isn't so effective against giant robots, so they ignored your potential because they didn't think it would sell toys. That's pretty close. The malevolence in Naito's eyes is fading. He had hoped to be doing more teasing, but now he's suddenly on the defensive. Izuku drives the point home. Feeling underappreciated, seeing worse students being given the chances you deserve? He says, and sees the acknowledgement in Naito's eyes. He probably thinks he is keeping himself unreadable, but he is giving everything away. Has anyone ever agreed with him before? They are deliberately trying to hold you down, he tells the other student. My sensei says this system is designed to pit us against each other, prioritizing those who are marketable over those with the talent and ambition to make a change. Nito frowns. Aizawa sensei said that? He looks doubtful. Izuku shakes his head. No, I have a personal tutor. He helped me get into a class. He could probably help you do the same. There are too many gifted students here not being shown the respect they deserve. He gives the other student a business card, and in the moment their hands touch he makes a connection. Naito's eyes widened in surprise. Is there something wrong? Izuku asks, but Nito smooths out his expression. I wasn't expecting our quirks to be so similar, Nito says carefully. Izuku smiles, and gets ready to take Naito's quirk if he shows any signs of doing anything to give him away. Nito flexes his fingers, but he looks thoughtful rather than concerned. You should talk to sensei, Izuku tells him. But if you do, please be honest. You'll find him very understanding of the situation people like us find themselves in. He picks up his tray, and leaves Nito looking at the business card. See ya. He gives a small half wave, and heads back to his table. The food here is pretty good. He sits, and eats, doing not much talking, but a lot of listening. Sensei was right, there were lots of students here with potential. They'd be better off kept whole than harvested in the attack. Izuku didn't know all of what Tamura was planning, only the stuff he had helped with, but there would be casualties. He had asked Sensei if he could keep students with more potential alive than with their quirks stripped from them out of harm's way, and he had assented. His teacher had been right. This harmful system of heroics grew resentment, and where there was resentment there were people like Minome Nito. Best to get him out of the way, as soon as he could. Today was the first day of heroics training. He may have made up with Kaken, but he could tell Aizawa hadn't been fighting seriously. Pro heroes were really on another level. He'd need all the practice he could get if he was going to survive this world. Thanks for watching my video, and make sure to check out the author of this fanfic. Link is in the description. See you next time. Till then, sayonara.